Gnosticism is one of the most misunderstood movements in the history of human thought. It was known primarily through the writings of those who condemned it. Church fathers like Irenaeus of Lyon described Gnostic beliefs in order to refute them systematically. Their accounts, while detailed, filtered everything through the lens of theological opposition. Then, in 1945, an Egyptian farmer digging near Nag Hammadi uncovered a sealed clay jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices containing over 50 texts written by Gnostics themselves. This discovery transformed our understanding of early Christianity and ancient philosophy entirely. The term Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge or insight. But this was not ordinary knowledge gained through study or rational argument. Gnosis referred to a direct experiential recognition of divine truth within oneself. The Gnostics believed that most humans walk through life in a state of spiritual amnesia. They have forgotten their true origin, which lies beyond this material world entirely. Salvation for the Gnostic meant waking up to this forgotten identity. Gnosticism was never a single unified religion with fixed doctrines and hierarchies. It was an umbrella term covering diverse groups that shared certain core intuitions. These groups flourished during the 2nd and 3rd centuries across the Mediterranean world. They included movements like Valentinianism, Scythianism, Manichaeism, and the Mandaeans. Some operated within Christian churches while holding radically different metaphysical views. Others developed entirely independent mythological systems to explain human existence. What united these diverse movements was a profound sense of alienation from the material world. Gnostics looked at human suffering, bodily decay, and cosmic violence with deep suspicion. They concluded that something had gone fundamentally wrong in the structure of reality itself. The world we inhabit, they argued, is not the creation of the highest God. It is the flawed product of a lesser, ignorant, or even malevolent being called the Demiurge. This creator deity, often identified with the Old Testament God, keeps humanity trapped in matter. The true God, according to Gnostic teaching, exists far beyond this cosmos in an eternal realm. That realm is called the Pleroma, a Greek word meaning fullness or completeness. From the Pleroma emanate divine beings called aeons, each representing an aspect of divinity. Through a cosmic catastrophe, a fragment of divine light became trapped in the material world. That fragment now resides within human beings as a divine spark awaiting liberation. The purpose of Gnostic practice is to recognize this spark and reunite it with its source. Part 1. The Architecture of Cosmic Tragedy. The Gnostic worldview rests on a fundamental philosophical problem that troubled ancient thinkers deeply. If God is perfect, good, and all-powerful, why does the world contain so much suffering? This question, known as the problem of evil, received radically different answers in antiquity. Mainstream Jewish and Christian theology argued that God created a good world, corrupted by human sin. Plato proposed that a benevolent craftsman shape matter as best he could, given its limitations. The Gnostics rejected both answers as fundamentally inadequate to explain observable reality. Look at the natural world without sentimental attachment, the Gnostics argued. And what do you see? You see creatures devouring each other in endless cycles of predation and death. You see diseases that strike the innocent, earthquakes that destroy cities, and famines that starve children. You see a system that seems indifferent to human suffering at its structural core. No perfectly good God could have designed this arrangement deliberately and called it good. Something else must be responsible for the conditions of material existence. The Gnostic answer was the concept of the Demiurge, borrowed but radically transformed from Plato. Plato had used the Greek term demiurgos, meaning craftsman or artisan, in his dialogue Timaeus. For Plato, the Demiurge was a benevolent figure who shaped matter according to eternal ideal forms. He worked with pre-existing materials and did the best possible job given their inherent limitations. The Gnostics took this concept and inverted its moral significance entirely. Their Demiurge was not benevolent, but ignorant, arrogant, and often actively hostile to humanity. The Gnostic creation myth begins not with chaos, but with the pleroma, the divine fullness above. Within the pleroma exists the true God, sometimes called the monad, the One, or the Father. This God is utterly transcendent, beyond description, beyond comprehension, beyond all categories. From this God emanate pairs of divine beings called aeons, each expressing a divine attribute. These aeons exist in harmonious pairs called syzygies, representing balanced masculine and feminine principles. The pleroma is a realm of pure light, perfect knowledge, and undisturbed spiritual wholeness. The cosmic catastrophe that produced our world began with the lowest aeon, often called Sophia. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom, and she represents the divine impulse to know and create. According to the myth, Sophia desired to comprehend the ultimate source from which she emanated. This desire exceeded what was permitted within the harmonious order of the pleroma itself. Her passion disrupted the divine balance and produced something that should never have existed. From her unauthorized creative act emerged a malformed being, the Demiurge himself. The Scythian texts describe the Demiurge as a monstrous figure with the body of a serpent. His head was that of a lion, an ancient symbol of irrational passion and untamed desire. His eyes flashed like lightning, suggesting both power and terrifying unpredictability. Sophia, horrified at what she had produced, cast him out of the divine realm entirely. Expelled into the void below the pleroma, the Demiurge knew nothing of his true origins. He believed himself to be the only God and proclaimed this claim with absolute arrogance. The Demiurge then set about creating the material cosmos using the deficient materials available to him. He fashioned the 7 planetary spheres, each ruled by lesser beings called archons. The word archon means ruler or authority in Greek, and these beings became cosmic jailers. They established the cycles of fate that bind human beings to endless suffering and rebirth. The stars and planets, which other ancient peoples worshipped as gods, were mere prison wardens. The entire material universe became a vast dungeon designed to keep divine sparks trapped. But something the Demiurge did not intend happened when he created human beings. In shaping Adam, he inadvertently breathed into humanity a portion of the divine light from above. This happened because Sophia, repenting of her error, worked secretly to redeem her mistake. She ensured that within each human body would dwell a spark of authentic divine origin. The Demiurge thus created beings who contained something greater than himself within them. This divine spark is the true self that Gnostic practice aims to awaken and liberate. The Demiurge, realizing the threat this posed, sought to keep humans ignorant of their divine nature. He instituted religious laws and moral codes designed to bind humanity to matter further. The commands given in the Garden of Eden, from this perspective, were acts of jealous control. The prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge kept humans in deliberate ignorance. The serpent who tempted Eve becomes, in Gnostic reading, an agent of liberation and awakening. This radical reversal of biblical values shocked Orthodox Christians and fueled their opposition. Understanding why Gnostics reached these conclusions requires examining their intellectual environment. Alexandria in Egypt was the great melting pot where Jewish, Greek and Persian ideas converged. Middle Platonism, the philosophical school dominant in the first centuries, taught a hierarchical cosmos. The highest divine principle existed far beyond the material world accessible to ordinary perception. Between that principle and matter existed intermediate beings responsible for cosmic administration. Gnostics absorbed these philosophical concepts and combined them with Jewish and Christian scriptures. Jewish traditions also contributed the idea of divine intermediaries involved in creation. The Book of Proverbs presents wisdom, or Sophia, as present with God before the world began. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher, distinguished between God and the Logos through which God acts. Some Jewish apocalyptic texts described hostile angelic powers ruling the present evil age. The Gospels themselves speak of Satan as the ruler of this world whom Christ came to defeat. Gnostics synthesized these diverse sources into a comprehensive mythology explaining human predicament. The different Gnostic schools elaborated this basic framework with significant variations in emphasis. The Sethian school, named for Adam's third son, Seth, represented the most radically dualistic tradition. They viewed the Demiurge as genuinely malevolent and the material world as an intentional prison. Salvation required complete rejection of the body and all its appetites and attachments. Ascetic practices aimed at weakening the body's hold over the divine spark within. The goal was escape from the cosmic system entirely, not its reformation or improvement. Valentinian Gnosticism, founded by the teacher Valentinus around the middle of the 2nd century, offered different views. Valentinus had studied in Alexandria and later taught in Rome with considerable success. According to some accounts, he nearly became Bishop of Rome before losing a contested election. His teachings represented an attempt to reconcile Gnostic insights with emerging Christian orthodoxy. The Valentinian Demiurge was ignorant rather than evil, foolish rather than malicious. He could be pitied and eventually redeemed rather than simply condemned and escaped. Valentinus taught that humanity is divided into 3 classes based on their inner composition. The hilics, or material people, possess only bodies and cannot achieve any form of spiritual salvation. The psychics, or unsouled people, have souls capable of faith and moral action, but not gnosis. These correspond to ordinary Christians who follow church teachings without deeper understanding. The pneumatics, or spiritual people, possess the divine spark and can achieve true gnosis. Only this third group, the spiritual elite, can return fully to the pleroma after death. This classification created a spiritual hierarchy that profoundly disturbed Orthodox Christian teachers. The emerging church proclaimed that salvation was available to all through faith in Christ alone. Gnostic elitism contradicted the universalism that Christianity was developing as its central message. It also threatened church authority by claiming access to secret teachings unknown to ordinary bishops. The Gnostics said they possessed traditions passed down from the apostles through private instruction. This claim to special revelation undermined the Church's monopoly on authentic Christian teaching. The cosmic drama of Gnostic mythology also contained a redemptive element that paralleled Christian teaching. The true God, having learned of the trapped divine sparks, sent emissaries to awaken them. These messengers of light descended through the archonic spheres in disguise to avoid detection. Christ was the primary figure identified as this Redeemer in Christian Gnostic systems. But the Gnostic Christ differed radically from the Christ of the emerging Orthodox Church. He was a purely spiritual being who only appeared to take on human flesh and suffer. This teaching, called Docetism, denied the reality of Christ's physical incarnation and crucifixion entirely. The word comes from the Greek dokein, meaning to seem or appear, indicating only appearance of flesh. Christ's body was an illusion, a temporary vehicle for communicating salvific knowledge to humanity. His death on the cross was either an appearance or occurred only to his material shell. The real Christ, the spiritual aeon, could never truly suffer or die in the physical sense. This protected divine transcendence but emptied the crucifixion of its orthodox redemptive meaning. For the Gnostics, salvation did not come through Christ's atoning death, but through his teaching. What Christ brought was gnosis itself, the knowledge that awakens the divine spark within. This knowledge was not intellectual information, but a transformative recognition of one's true identity. To know oneself at the deepest level was simultaneously to know God, because they are the same. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered at Nag Hammadi, records sayings emphasizing this self-knowledge. It presents Jesus as a teacher of wisdom rather than a sacrificial victim for human sin. The implications of this Gnostic cosmology extended into ethics and human behavior in complex ways. Some Gnostic groups practiced extreme asceticism, denying the body all pleasures and comforts. If matter is evil and the body a prison, then mortifying the flesh demonstrates spiritual freedom. Fasting, celibacy, and withdrawal from worldly activities became marks of advanced spiritual attainment. The body's desires were traps set by the archons to keep the divine spark attached to matter. Overcoming these desires proved mastery over the cosmic prison system designed to enslave humanity. Other Gnostic groups drew precisely the opposite ethical conclusions from the same cosmological premises. If the body is merely a prison and its actions have no spiritual significance, then nothing matters. One could indulge every bodily appetite because such actions cannot touch the divine spark within. Sexual libertinism and rejection of moral law became for some expressions of spiritual freedom. The Demiurge's commandments were chains to be broken, not laws to be obeyed with reverence. This antinomian tendency scandalized observers and gave opponents ammunition for condemnation. The intellectual historian Hans Jonas argued that this Gnostic worldview expressed something universal in human experience. Writing in the 20th century, Jonas saw parallels between ancient Gnosticism and modern existentialism. Both traditions begin with the experience of alienation, of not being at home in the world. Both see the human being as thrown into a hostile or indifferent cosmos without consent or explanation. Both locate authenticity in an inner dimension that must be discovered against external pressures. The Gnostic diagnosis of the human condition anticipates modern philosophical themes by 2 millennia. The political philosopher Erik Voegelin extended this analysis to diagnose modern ideological movements as Gnostic. Revolutionary ideologies that promise to transform reality through special knowledge exhibit Gnostic patterns. The belief that human knowledge can create earthly perfection echoes Gnostic confidence in Gnosis. The sense of alienation from existing society motivates both ancient Gnostics and modern revolutionaries alike. Voegelin argued that Marxism, National Socialism, and progressivism all contain hidden Gnostic assumptions. This controversial thesis sparked decades of scholarly debate about Gnosticism's modern relevance and meaning. Part 2. Sophia and the Geometry of Catastrophe. The figure of Sophia stands at the centre of Gnostic mythology as its most tragic character. Her name means wisdom in Greek, connecting her to ancient traditions of personified divine knowledge. In the book of Proverbs, wisdom declares that she was with God before creation began. She played beside the divine throne as the world was fashioned, delighting in the cosmos and humanity. Jewish wisdom literature presents her as accessible, calling out in the streets for people to follow. The Gnostics transformed this benevolent figure into someone whose actions caused cosmic catastrophe. Within the Pleroma, Sophia occupied the outermost position among the divine aeons or emanations. She was the youngest, the most distant from the source, and consequently the most vulnerable. Her location at the boundary between divine fullness and the void made her uniquely susceptible to error. The texts describe her as seized by a passion to know the unknowable Father directly. This desire exceeded the capacity of any aeon, since the Father transcends all comprehension absolutely. Even the highest aeons cannot grasp the ultimate source from which they eternally flow. The technical term for Sophia's error in Valentinian texts is tolma, meaning audacity or presumption. This Greek philosophical concept described the soul's overreaching beyond its proper station and limits. Middle Platonists had already used tolma to explain how multiplicity emerged from original unity. The Gnostics adopted this philosophical vocabulary to explain the origin of the material cosmos. Sophia's audacity was not moral evil, but an excess of the divine impulse toward knowledge. Her passion was a distorted reflection of the very quality that defined her nature as wisdom. What Sophia produced through her unauthorized creative act varied across different Gnostic systems significantly. In Scythian texts, she directly generated the monstrous demiurge called Yaldabaoth, or Samael. Yaldabaoth means child of chaos in Aramaic, indicating his origin outside proper divine order. Samael means blind god, emphasizing his ignorance of the true divinity above him entirely. This creature emerged as an abortion, a malformed being lacking the balanced syzygy of paired aeons. Without a masculine counterpart, Sophia's creation was inherently deficient and incomplete from its origin. Valentinian texts present a more elaborate and philosophically sophisticated version of this drama. Sophia's passion first produced not the demiurge directly, but a formless substance called her intention. This intention, separated from Sophia herself, became a lower Sophia called Achamoth, or Sophia Prunikos. The name Achamoth derives from the Hebrew word for wisdom, chokmah, in its Aramaic form. Prunikos means the lustful one, indicating the passionate nature of this fallen divine element. It was this lower Sophia, exiled from the Pleroma, who then produced the demiurge below. The distinction between higher and lower Sophia allowed Valentinians to preserve wisdom's dignity partially. The original Aeon Sophia was restored to the Pleroma through the intervention of a saviour figure. Her error was corrected, her passion separated from her, and she returned to harmonious divine existence. Meanwhile, her detached intention continued its degraded existence outside the realm of light. This splitting of Sophia into two figures enabled a more nuanced theodicy than Scythian radicalism allowed. The fall was real, but not absolute, and redemption remained possible for what had fallen. The lower Sophia's experience outside the Pleroma became the template for the human condition itself. She wandered in the void, experiencing emotions that would later constitute the material world's substance. These emotions included grief over her separation, fear of annihilation, confusion about her state, and ignorance. From these passions the Valentinians taught, the four elements of matter ultimately derived. Earth came from grief, water from tears and fear, air from confusion, and fire from ignorance itself. The material world literally consists of crystallized divine suffering, transformed into physical substance. This account of matter's origin differs radically from both biblical creation and Greek philosophical cosmogony. The Bible presents matter as created good by God's deliberate will and powerful command. Greek philosophy generally viewed matter as eternal, uncreated, and simply given for the demiurge to shape. The Gnostic position makes matter the byproduct of divine error and emotional suffering specifically. This explains why matter seems so resistant to spiritual purposes and productive of endless pain. The world hurts because it is made of hurt, composed from the anguish of a fallen divinity. The geometry of Gnostic cosmology arranged reality in descending levels of being from the Pleroma downward. At the summit exists the unknowable Father, absolutely transcendent and beyond all description or comprehension. From the Father emanate the aeons in pairs, each level slightly more distant from the original source. Below the Pleroma lies the middle, where the lower Sophia and eventually the demiurge come to exist. Below that stretch the 7 planetary spheres, each ruled by an archon serving the demiurge's purposes. At the bottom lies the earth, the densest and most remote point from divine light and truth. This vertical cosmology encoded a spiritual geography that the soul must traverse to return home. Death releases the divine spark from its bodily prison, but liberation is not automatic or guaranteed. The spark must ascend through the archonic spheres, each guarded by hostile powers demanding passwords. These passwords or formulas were secret knowledge that Gnostic initiates received through their communities. Without proper gnosis, the ascending soul would be captured and recycled back into material existence. Reincarnation was not spiritual progress, but failure to escape the Demiurge's recycling system for sparks. The Sophia myth also carries profound implications about the nature of wisdom and knowledge themselves. True wisdom, paradoxically, must acknowledge the limits of what can be known or achieved. Sophia erred precisely because she sought knowledge that exceeded her station within divine hierarchy. Yet gnosis itself is the means of salvation, the very knowledge that liberates trapped divine sparks. This creates a tension between the danger of seeking forbidden knowledge and knowledge as salvific power. The Gnostics distinguish between the Demiurge's false knowledge and the true gnosis from above. The feminine gender of Sophia and her central role challenged ancient assumptions about divine activity. In most Mediterranean religions, masculine deities performed the primary acts of cosmic creation and rule. The Gnostics placed a feminine figure at the pivotal moment where divine fullness produces material existence. This was not simply mythological accident, but reflected deeper assumptions about generation and creativity. The feminine principle was associated with receptivity, desire, and the capacity to bring forth new being. These very qualities, when unbalanced, produced the catastrophe that generated our suffering cosmos. Some scholars have interpreted the Sophia myth as encoding ancient anxieties about feminine power and sexuality. The passionate, boundary-crossing female whose desire creates disaster reflects patriarchal fear narratives. Yet other interpretations emphasize Sophia's ultimate restoration and the necessity of feminine divine elements. Valentinian rituals included the bridal chamber, symbolizing the reunification of masculine and feminine principles. The eschatological goal was not masculine dominance, but syzygy, the harmonious pairing of complementary opposites. Salvation meant healing the original rupture that occurred when Sophia acted without her masculine counterpart. The philosophical sophistication of the Sophia myth impressed even some of its ancient critics, observing carefully. It addressed genuine metaphysical problems about how multiplicity arises from unity in any system. It explained the origin of evil without attributing it directly to the highest divine principle whatsoever. It provided psychological depth by grounding cosmic structure in recognizable emotional experiences universally shared. The myth functioned simultaneously as cosmology, theodicy, psychology, and spiritual roadmap for practitioners. This multivalence accounts for its persistence across diverse Gnostic communities, despite their many differences. Part 3. The Platonic Inheritance. Gnosticism cannot be understood apart from the philosophy of Plato and his intellectual descendants. The Gnostics borrowed extensively from Platonic vocabulary, concepts, and metaphysical frameworks throughout their texts. Yet they transformed what they borrowed in ways that horrified philosophers committed to the original tradition. The relationship between Gnosticism and Platonism reveals how ideas mutate when transplanted across world views. What began as a vision of cosmic harmony became, in Gnostic hands, a diagnosis of cosmic disease. Understanding this transformation requires examining Plato's original teachings about reality and creation carefully. Plato taught that the visible world we perceive is not ultimate reality, but a shadow of something higher. True reality consists of eternal forms, or ideas, that exist in a purely intelligible realm beyond change. The form of beauty itself is more real than any beautiful object we can see or touch. Material things are beautiful only by participating in or reflecting that eternal form imperfectly. This doctrine established a hierarchical ontology distinguishing permanent intelligible reality from changing sensible appearance. The Gnostics adopted this basic framework but radicalized its implications about the material world's value. In his dialogue Timaeus, Plato described how the visible cosmos came into existence through divine craftsmanship. A figure he called the Demiurge, the divine craftsman, looked upon the eternal forms as models. He then shaped pre-existing chaotic matter into the best possible image of those perfect intelligible patterns. The cosmos that resulted was not perfect, because matter itself resists perfect formation inevitably. But it was as good as any material thing could possibly be, given matter's inherent limitations. The Demiurge worked benevolently, wanting to share the goodness of the forms with material existence. Plato's Demiurge was thus fundamentally good, not ignorant or malevolent as the Gnostic Demiurge would become. He was called a god, though subordinate to the higher principle of the good beyond being itself. His creation was described as a living creature, ensouled and intelligent, worthy of admiration and reverence. The stars and planets were divine beings, gods visible to human eyes, not archonic prison wardens. Later, Platonists would worship the cosmos as a manifestation of divine reason and beautiful order. This positive cosmic piety stood in direct contradiction to the Gnostic rejection of material existence. The Middle Platonists, active during the centuries when Gnosticism emerged, developed Plato's thought further systematically. They emphasized the radical transcendence of the highest divine principle beyond all description and comprehension. This principle, sometimes called the One or the Good, exceeded even the categories of being and thought. Between this transcendent source and the material world, they posited intermediate divine beings and principles. The Demiurge became one such intermediate, the divine mind that contained the forms and shaped matter. This hierarchical structure of emanating divine levels provided the template for Gnostic pleromatic geography. The concept of emanation itself came from Platonic attempts to explain how multiplicity derives from original unity. The One does not create deliberately the way a craftsman makes an artifact through conscious decision. Rather, divine reality overflows spontaneously, like light radiating from the sun without diminishing its source. Each level of emanation is slightly less perfect, more distant from the original unity and its perfection. This explains the gradual degradation from pure unity down to the multiplicity and division of matter. The Gnostics adopted emanationist logic but intensified the degradation until matter became positively evil. A crucial Platonic concept that the Gnostics transformed was the relationship between soul and body fundamentally. Plato had described the body as a prison or tomb for the soul in his dialogue, Phaedo specifically. The soul's goal was liberation from bodily entanglement through philosophical purification and rational contemplation. Death, properly prepared for, released the philosopher's soul to return to its true intelligible home. This soul-body dualism provided obvious support for Gnostic claims about divine sparks trapped in matter. But Plato never concluded that the body's creator was evil, or that matter itself was cosmic disaster. For Plato, embodiment was a descent, but also an opportunity for the soul to develop virtue through struggle. The challenges of bodily existence provided occasions for practicing courage, temperance, and justice meaningfully. The material world, though inferior to the intelligible realm, served educational purposes for incarnate souls properly. Philosophy itself was preparation for death, training the soul to separate from bodily attachments gradually. This relatively positive view of embodiment's purpose disappeared in Gnostic absolute rejection of material existence. Where Plato saw pedagogy, the Gnostics saw only imprisonment by hostile cosmic powers deliberately entrapping sparks. The Gnostic transformation of Platonic philosophy involved several decisive moves away from original positions. First, they moralized the ontological hierarchy, making lower levels not merely less perfect, but actively evil. The Demiurge's ignorance became culpable arrogance, his creation not limitation, but deliberate malice or foolishness. Second, they historicized the metaphysical structure, turning emanation into a dramatic narrative of fall and potential redemption. Third, they personalized cosmic principles into mythological characters with emotions, motives, and conflicting agendas. These transformations converted philosophical speculation into salvific mythology, accessible to non-philosophers entirely. Numenius of Apamea, a 2nd-century Platonist, illustrates the boundary between philosophy and Gnostic transformation intriguingly. He distinguished sharply between a first God, who is utterly transcendent, and a second God who creates. The second God, by looking toward matter to shape it, becomes divided and distracted from pure contemplation. This degradation through contact with matter approaches but does not quite reach the Gnostic position definitively. Numenius remained a Platonist because he affirmed the cosmos's fundamental goodness despite its metaphysical inferiority. The Gnostics crossed a line that philosophers like Numenius approached but ultimately refused to transgress. The concepts of hypostasis and ousia, central to later Christian theology, originated in Platonic philosophical vocabulary. Hypostasis referred to the underlying reality or substantial existence of something beyond mere appearance. Ousia meant essence or being, the fundamental nature that makes something what it truly is metaphysically. The Gnostics deployed these technical terms throughout their texts to give philosophical gravity to mythological claims. This vocabulary created apparent intellectual respectability while conveying ideas that contradicted Platonic conclusions entirely. The Church Fathers would later adopt the same vocabulary for Orthodox, Trinitarian, and Christological formulations. The theory of forms provided another resource that Gnostics appropriated and transformed for their own purposes. Plato's forms were eternal patterns of perfection that material things imitate imperfectly but genuinely participate in. The Gnostics relocated the forms within the pleroma as attributes or aspects of the divine aeons themselves. The aeon, called nous, contained mind itself. Aletheia contained truth. Logos contained reason or word. This personalization of abstract forms into divine beings converted metaphysics into mythology systematically throughout Gnostic texts. Where Plato analyzed, the Gnostics narrated, trading philosophical argument for mythological drama consistently. The question of why Gnostics made these transformations admits multiple complementary answers from different perspectives. Religiously, they sought salvation rather than mere understanding, liberation rather than contemplative satisfaction alone. Sociologically, they addressed communities that lacked philosophical training but craved cosmic meaning and hope desperately. Psychologically, they expressed alienation from the world more intense than Platonic detachment ever articulated before. Historically, they emerged during crises that made cosmic optimism increasingly difficult to maintain sincerely. The Roman peace brought political stability, but also spiritual anxiety that philosophical schools could not adequately address. The Platonic inheritance remained visible throughout Gnostic systems even as they transformed its fundamental meaning entirely. Terms like Demiurge, emanation, intelligible realm, and soul's ascent came directly from philosophical tradition, obviously. The hierarchical cosmos with transcendent source and descending levels of reality was thoroughly Platonic in structure. The goal of liberating the soul from material entanglement to return to its true home echoed Plato precisely. But the moral reversal that made the craftsman god ignorant or evil inverted everything Platonism stood for fundamentally. This combination of formal similarity and substantive contradiction made Gnosticism both familiar and deeply disturbing to philosophers. Part 4. Plotinus against the world haters. Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism, encountered Gnostic teachings in 3rd century Rome and reacted with controlled fury. His treatise against the Gnostics, preserved as the 9th tractate of his second Ennead, remains our best philosophical critique. Plotinus did not simply dismiss Gnostic doctrines as absurd, though he found them deeply wrong-headed throughout. He engaged their arguments carefully, showing where they departed from sound Platonic reasoning specifically. His critique reveals both what made Gnosticism attractive and why mainstream philosophy ultimately rejected it completely. The confrontation between Plotinus and the Gnostics illuminates fundamental choices about how to interpret human existence. Plotinus's school in Rome included students who were reading Gnostic texts with evident interest and sympathy. Porphyry, his student and biographer, mentions that they possessed copies of Zostrianos and Allogenes specifically. These Scythian Gnostic texts, later discovered at Nag Hammadi, circulated among philosophically educated seekers widely. Plotinus worried that his own students were being seduced by what he considered philosophical corruption fundamentally. His treatise was thus not abstract refutation, but pastoral intervention, aimed at reclaiming endangered souls personally. He asked Porphyry and another student, Emilius, to write additional refutations of points he had not addressed himself. The core of Plotinus's objection was that the Gnostics hated the visible cosmos without philosophical justification whatsoever. They called the world evil, the creation of an ignorant or malicious deity, a prison for divine sparks. Plotinus found this position both logically incoherent and morally objectionable on multiple grounds simultaneously. If the intelligible realm is good, and this world is its image, how can the image be purely evil philosophically? An image necessarily resembles its model, even if imperfectly, so material existence must retain some goodness. To hate the image while claiming to love the model involved a contradiction the Gnostics never adequately resolved. Plotinus defended the beauty and divinity of the visible cosmos with genuine philosophical passion throughout his treatise. The stars and planets, which Gnostics demoted to archonic prison wardens, Plotinus called our noble kinsmen reverently. The sun, the moon, and the celestial spheres manifest divine reason in visible form for contemplation and admiration. Even the earth, with its mountains, rivers, and living creatures, displays wisdom worthy of philosophical appreciation. To despise this cosmic order revealed, for Plotinus, a failure of perception rather than superior spiritual insight, actually. The Gnostics lacked the philosophical training to see the divine shining through material appearances properly. Another central objection concerned the Gnostic multiplication of divine beings and mythological dramatics excessively. Where Plato's system was elegant and economical, Gnostic cosmology proliferated aeons, archons, and intermediate entities endlessly. Plotinus mocked their invented names and elaborate genealogies as philosophical barbarism, lacking rational justification entirely. They spoke of Sophia's fall, the Demiurge's arrogance, and cosmic warfare without demonstrating any of it logically. Myth replaced argument, narrative replaced analysis, and emotional appeal replaced philosophical rigor throughout their systems. This offended Plotinus's commitment to rational inquiry as the proper path to truth about ultimate reality. The Gnostic claim to possess special revelation unavailable to ordinary philosophers particularly irritated Plotinus greatly. They asserted secret teachings transmitted from apostles or heavenly revealer figures outside normal channels of knowledge. This claim to privileged access contradicted the philosophical principle that truth is publicly available to rational inquiry. Anyone with sufficient intelligence and training could ascend to knowledge of the One through contemplative discipline properly. No special gnosis was required beyond what philosophy itself provided through its established methods of investigation. Plotinus saw Gnostic elitism as a betrayal of philosophy's democratic potential for all rational beings equally. Plotinus also criticized the Gnostic attitude toward the soul's relationship to the material world as fundamentally confused. They spoke as if the soul were merely a prisoner, wholly alien to its bodily context, purely victimized. Plotinus taught that the soul descended into matter partly through its own choice and for its own development necessarily. The experience of embodiment, while challenging, provided opportunities for virtue impossible in purely spiritual existence alone. Furthermore, the world soul that animates the entire cosmos was not fallen, but divine, performing its proper function perfectly. To call the cosmic soul ignorant or evil insulted a divine being that deserved reverence rather than contempt. The ethical implications of Gnosticism troubled Plotinus as much as its metaphysical errors and mythological excesses. If the body and material world are evil, what motivation remains for moral action within physical existence meaningfully? The Gnostics offered no coherent ethics, Plotinus charged, because their cosmology dissolved the basis for moral distinctions entirely. They claimed special status as pneumatics, spiritual elite, regardless of their actual behavior or virtue demonstrated. This antinomian potential, the license to ignore moral law, contradicted everything philosophy taught about human excellence properly. True philosophy cultivated virtue, trained character, and prepared the soul through disciplined moral effort, not claims of special knowledge. Plotinus acknowledged that the Gnostics had borrowed much from Plato, but he argued they corrupted everything borrowed systematically. They took the Demiurge and made him ignorant, took emanation and made it catastrophic degradation entirely. They took the soul's longing for transcendence and twisted it into hatred for the world soul properly animates. Every Platonic doctrine passed through Gnostic transformation, emerged distorted beyond philosophical recognition or acceptability. Plotinus treated them as bad students who had misunderstood their teacher and now propagated errors confidently to others. His critique was thus simultaneously philosophical refutation and pedagogical correction aimed at preventing further misunderstanding. The Neoplatonic alternative that Plotinus offered retained transcendence without world rejection or cosmic pessimism necessarily. The one remained absolutely beyond description, the source from which all reality eternally flows through emanation processes. The divine mind contained the forms and contemplated the one in perfect intellectual vision without distraction or degradation. The world soul animated the cosmos with rationality and beauty, not ignorance and malice, as the Gnostics claimed falsely. Matter itself, while lowest in the hierarchy, was not evil, but simply the limit where divine emanation naturally faded. This system preserved hierarchy and transcendence, while affirming the goodness of existence at every level consistently. The practice Plotinus recommended was philosophical contemplation, not secret gnosis or magical passwords for ascent. Through disciplined thought, purification of desire, and moral development, the soul could ascend toward the One systematically. This ascent was available to anyone with philosophical capacity, not limited to a predestined spiritual elite exclusively. The goal was not escape from an evil cosmos, but reunion with the source from which one had never truly separated. Even while embodied, the soul could experience mystical union with the One through contemplative breakthrough moments. Plotinus himself reportedly achieved such union 4 times during the years Porphyry studied with him directly. The confrontation between Plotinus and the Gnostics established a pattern that would repeat throughout Western intellectual history. Whenever transcendence-oriented spirituality emerged, a choice presented itself between cosmic affirmation and cosmic rejection starkly. Plotinus represented the path of finding the divine within the world, through the world, not against it fundamentally. The Gnostics represented the path of radical alienation, seeking the divine only by negating worldly existence entirely. Both paths claimed Platonic heritage, Both sought liberation from material limitation, both aimed at divine union ultimately. But their opposed evaluations of the cosmos between them made all the practical and theoretical difference imaginable. Later, Neoplatonists continued Plotinus's anti-Gnostic polemic, while sometimes absorbing elements from the traditions they opposed subtly. Porphyry wrote against the Gnostics, as his teacher had requested, though his works on this subject are now lost. Iamblichus developed theurgical practices that some scholars see as influenced by Gnostic ritual traditions indirectly. Proclus systematized Neoplatonism into an elaborate hierarchical structure rivaling Gnostic complexity in its own way differently. The boundaries between philosophy and Gnostic religion remained contested throughout late antiquity, despite Plotinus's efforts decisively. Ideas crossed these boundaries in both directions, creating hybrid forms that satisfied neither pure philosophers nor pure Gnostics entirely. Part 5. The Alexandrian Crucible. Alexandria in Egypt served as the primary laboratory where Gnostic ideas were synthesized from diverse ingredients originally. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, the city became the ancient world's greatest center of learning. Its famous library collected texts from every culture the Greek world had contacted through trade and conquest. Jewish, Egyptian, Persian, Babylonian, and Greek traditions mingled in its streets, schools, and religious communities constantly. This unprecedented concentration of diverse wisdom traditions created conditions for new syntheses previously impossible anywhere. Gnosticism emerged from this crucible as a genuinely multicultural creation, drawing from multiple ancient sources simultaneously. The Jewish community in Alexandria was the largest and most intellectually sophisticated outside Palestine itself originally. These Jews spoke Greek, read their scriptures in Greek translation, and engaged Greek philosophy seriously as intellectual partners. Philo of Alexandria, roughly contemporary with Jesus, exemplified this synthesis of Jewish faith and Platonic philosophy brilliantly. He interpreted the Hebrew Bible allegorically, finding Platonic truths encoded in the narratives of Moses and the prophets throughout. His concept of the Logos, the divine word through which God creates and governs, influenced both Christians and Gnostics subsequently. Philo demonstrated that Jewish revelation and Greek philosophy could be harmonized through sophisticated interpretive methods systematically. Jewish apocalyptic literature provided another crucial ingredient for the Gnostic synthesis emerging in this environment. Texts like 1st Enoch and the Book of Jubilees described heavenly journeys through multiple celestial spheres and divine palaces. They populated the cosmos with angelic and demonic beings governing different aspects of creation and human destiny constantly. The periodization of history into ages, each dominated by different spiritual powers, shaped apocalyptic worldviews fundamentally. Evil was attributed to rebellious angels who had corrupted creation and would be defeated in an imminent cosmic judgment. Gnostics adopted this populated cosmos while radically reinterpreting which beings were good and which were truly evil. Persian religion, specifically Zoroastrianism, contributed the most systematic dualism available in the ancient Mediterranean world directly. Zoroaster had taught that reality was divided between Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. These two principles were locked in cosmic warfare, with creation as the battleground and human souls as the prize contested. The material world was not evil in Zoroastrianism, but the arena where good must struggle against evil for ultimate victory. Gnostics absorbed dualistic frameworks while intensifying the negativity toward matter beyond anything Zoroastrianism had taught originally. The Manichaean form of Gnosticism would later synthesize Christian, Zoroastrian, and Buddhist elements most comprehensively of all. Egyptian religion contributed imagery and concepts that surfaced throughout Gnostic texts in transformed versions significantly. The ancient Egyptian myth of Isis, searching for the scattered body of Osiris, paralleled Sophia gathering the scattered light particles. The descent to the underworld and return, central to Egyptian afterlife beliefs, mapped onto Gnostic soul ascent narratives directly. The elaborate Egyptian interest in proper treatment of the dead may have influenced Gnostic concern for the soul's posthumous journey. Hermetic literature, blending Greek philosophy with Egyptian religious imagery, circulated alongside Gnostic texts in similar communities. 3 Hermetic texts were actually discovered among the Nag Hammadi codices, confirming their close association historically. Greek philosophy provided the conceptual framework that organized these diverse materials into coherent, systematic structures. Platonic metaphysics supplied the hierarchical cosmos with transcendent source, intermediate beings, and material manifestation at bottom. Stoic concepts of the Logos as cosmic reason pervading all things influenced how Gnostics understood divine presence in creation. Pythagorean number mysticism and interest in cosmic harmony shaped Gnostic speculation about aeons and their relationships mathematically. Even Aristotelian logic provided tools for the systematic exposition of Gnostic doctrines in philosophical terms rigorously. The Gnostics were not anti-philosophical, but selectively philosophical, taking what served their religious purposes while rejecting what did not fit. Christianity itself emerged from this same Alexandrian environment and maintained complex relationships with Gnostic movements throughout early centuries. The Gospel of John, with its emphasis on light, darkness, word, and knowledge, used vocabulary also central to Gnostic discourse. Paul's letters distinguished between flesh and spirit, psychic and pneumatic people, in ways Gnostics found easy to appropriate selectively. The question of whether Gnosticism influenced Christianity or Christianity produced Gnosticism remains debated among scholars endlessly today. Most likely, both movements drew from common sources while developing in different directions through mutual interaction over time. They were siblings from the same parents rather than parent and child in either direction exclusively. The social conditions of Alexandria facilitated the emergence of new religious movements, combining diverse traditions creatively. The city contained people uprooted from traditional communities, seeking meaning in a cosmopolitan environment lacking stable identity anchors. Traditional religions seemed inadequate to explain the suffering and injustice visible everywhere in imperial urban life daily. The promise of special knowledge offering escape from this unsatisfactory existence appealed to those alienated from conventional options strongly. Gnosticism offered both explanation and solution, both diagnosis and cure, for the spiritual malaise of Mediterranean urban populations widely. Its success reflected genuine needs that neither traditional religions nor philosophical schools were adequately addressing for many people. The major Gnostic teachers, whose names we know, were associated with Alexandria directly or educated in its traditions originally. Basilides taught in Alexandria during the reign of Hadrian, developing an elaborate system with 365 heavens and cosmic powers. His son Isidore continued his teaching, and Basilidean communities survived in Egypt until the 4th century, at least persistently. Valentinus was born in Egypt, educated in Alexandria, before moving to Rome, where he nearly became bishop remarkably. Even Marcion, though from Pontus originally, developed his radical theology in dialogue with Alexandrian textual and philosophical traditions directly. Alexandria was to Gnosticism what Athens had been to classical philosophy, its birthplace and intellectual capital undisputedly. The interpretive methods developed in Alexandria proved essential for Gnostic approaches to scripture and tradition specifically. Allegorical reading, pioneered by Greek scholars interpreting Homer and developed by Philo for the Bible, became the Gnostic standard method. Every text concealed deeper meanings, accessible only to those with spiritual insight beyond the literal surface reading completely. The Old Testament, with its violent tribal god and problematic narratives, could be decoded as documenting the Demiurge's malevolent activities actually. Christian scriptures revealed Christ as the emissary from the true God, teaching Gnosis that liberates from demiurgic enslavement entirely. This hermeneutical flexibility allowed Gnostics to claim virtually any text supported their system when read with proper understanding deeply. The library tradition of Alexandria also shaped how Gnostic knowledge was preserved and transmitted across generations systematically. Gnostics produced extensive written texts, unlike many mystery religions that relied primarily on oral transmission and ritual experience. The Nag Hammadi library itself probably belonged to a monastery whose monks valued these texts enough to preserve them carefully. This literary orientation meant that Gnostic ideas could spread beyond face-to-face teaching communities through textual circulation widely. It also meant that Gnostic teachings could be studied, compared and criticized by opponents who obtained copies for examination purposes. The Church Fathers who wrote against Gnosticism often quoted extensively from texts they had acquired and read thoroughly themselves. The decline of Alexandria's centrality coincided with Gnosticism's suppression as Christian Orthodoxy consolidated imperial power officially. The destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE symbolized the end of pagan Alexandria's cultural dominance permanently and dramatically. Christian mobs, imperial edicts, and episcopal authority combined to marginalize non-orthodox religious movements systematically throughout the empire. Gnostic communities retreated to the margins, their texts hidden or destroyed, their teachers silenced or absorbed into orthodoxy's triumph. The Nag Hammadi burial preserved one fragment of this suppressed tradition for later rediscovery unexpectedly and providentially almost. Modern scholarship has partially reconstructed what was lost, but much remains irrecoverable from the Alexandrian Crucible's most creative period. Part 6. Valentinus and the Sophistication of Heresy. Valentinus represents the most philosophically sophisticated and historically significant teacher within the Gnostic movement overall. Born around 100 CE in the Egyptian Delta region, he received the finest Hellenistic education available in Alexandria's schools. Ancient sources report that he studied with a certain Theudas, who claimed to have learned from the Apostle Paul directly. This claimed apostolic lineage gave Valentinus's teachings a legitimacy that purely philosophical speculation could not provide independently. He developed a system so subtle and persuasive that it nearly captured the institutional church from within its own structures. Understanding Valentinus requires appreciating both his philosophical brilliance and his strategic religious positioning simultaneously. Valentinus moved from Alexandria to Rome around 136 CE and quickly established himself as an influential Christian teacher there. He taught publicly within the Roman Church, attracting students and developing his distinctive interpretation of Christian faith systematically. According to Tertullian, he expected to become Bishop of Rome because of his intellectual brilliance and rhetorical gifts particularly. When another candidate was chosen, supposedly because of that candidate's status as a confessor who had suffered for faith, Valentinus was passed over. Whether this account is historically accurate or later polemical invention remains uncertain, but it indicates his prominence clearly. His movement remained active within mainstream churches for decades before clear boundaries between Orthodoxy and Heresy were firmly established. The Valentinian system distinguished itself from other Gnostic schools through its relative moderation and subtlety philosophically. Where Scythian texts portrayed the Demiurge as actively malevolent, an arrogant tyrant deliberately enslaving humanity through ignorance, Valentinus was gentler. His Demiurge was ignorant rather than evil, foolish rather than malicious, deserving pity rather than hatred or fear. This allowed Valentinians to maintain more positive relationships with the Old Testament and its God than radical Gnostics could sustain. They did not reject Jewish scripture entirely, but reinterpreted it as documenting the Demiurge's limited but not wholly corrupt activities meaningfully. This moderation made Valentinianism more acceptable to Christians who could not abandon their Jewish scriptural heritage completely. The Valentinian pleroma contained 30 aeons, arranged in a complex hierarchical structure with mathematical precision carefully. The first 8 aeons formed the Ogdoad, the original divine family from which all subsequent emanations derived their being. These included the Father and his consort Silence, from whom emerged mind and truth, then word and life, then human and church. Each pair or syzygy represented complementary principles whose harmonious union maintained the pleroma's stability and fullness properly. The remaining 22 aeons emanated in subsequent generations, filling out the divine fullness with every conceivable perfection. This elaborate structure satisfied intellectual appetites for systematic completeness that simpler theologies left unsatisfied entirely. Sophia's fall in the Valentinian version was more psychologically nuanced than in cruder Gnostic accounts preceding it. She was not simply rebellious or arrogant, but driven by genuine love and desire to know the Father directly and completely. Her passion exceeded what the divine order permitted, but the passion itself was not wholly blameworthy given its object properly. The tragedy lay in the impossibility of her desire, rather than in moral failure, deserving simple condemnation outright. This sympathetic portrayal of Sophia made the cosmic fall comprehensible in human emotional terms that listeners could recognize personally. Everyone has experienced desire that exceeded what circumstances allowed, longing for what could not be legitimately possessed or achieved. The restoration of the fallen Sophia in Valentinian teaching introduced a figure called the limit or cross significantly. This divine principle separated Sophia from her illegitimate passion, purifying her and allowing her return to the pleroma safely. Her passion, now separated from her, became the lower Sophia or Achamoth, who would produce the Demiurge below eventually. The cross thus functioned cosmologically before it functioned historically, establishing boundaries that preserved divine order from corruption. Christian symbolism of the cross could be mapped onto this cosmological function, giving familiar religious imagery new metaphysical depth. Valentinus excelled at such double mappings that allowed his followers to remain within Christian communities while holding esoteric interpretations secretly. The Valentinian Christ was a complex figure uniting multiple divine and cosmic functions within a single saving activity comprehensively. As an aeon within the pleroma, Christ helped restore Sophia and stabilize the divine fullness after her disruptive passion initially. As an emissary to the lower realm, he brought Gnosis to those capable of receiving it and awakening to their divine nature. The historical Jesus was the vehicle through which this cosmic Christ operated within material existence temporarily but transformatively. His death on the cross enacted the cosmic function of the limit, separating spirit from matter, light from darkness, definitively. This multi-layered Christology allowed Valentinians to affirm orthodox language while understanding it in radically different metaphysical terms secretly. The division of humanity into three classes was characteristic of Valentinian anthropology and soteriology particularly. The hilics, or material people, were composed only of matter and could achieve no spiritual salvation under any circumstances whatsoever. The psychics, or soul people, possessed souls capable of moral action and faith, but lacked the pneumatic spark enabling full gnosis directly. These corresponded to ordinary Christians who followed church teachings, received sacraments, and lived moral lives faithfully but incompletely. The pneumatics, or spiritual people, possessed the divine spark and could achieve full reunion with the pleroma through gnosis completely. Valentinians identified themselves as pneumatics while maintaining fellowship with psychic Christians in the same churches diplomatically. This threefold anthropology created a spiritual hierarchy that Orthodox Christians found deeply troubling for multiple serious reasons simultaneously. It suggested that salvation depended on innate spiritual constitution rather than faith, grace, or moral effort available to everyone. It implied that most Christians were second-class believers, incapable of the highest spiritual achievements regardless of their devotion. It justified secrecy, since the psychics could not understand and should not receive teachings meant only for pneumatics exclusively. The Church was developing a message of universal salvation available to all through faith, contradicted by Valentinian spiritual elitism fundamentally. This tension between elite gnosis and democratic faith became a central battleground in second-century Christian controversies consistently. Valentinian ritual practice included a mysterious ceremony called the bridal chamber, whose exact nature remains debated among scholars. It apparently symbolized or enacted the reunion of the divine spark with its heavenly counterpart or syzygy partner spiritually. Each pneumatic possessed an angelic twin in the pleroma, and salvation involved reuniting with this celestial partner ultimately. The bridal chamber may have involved actual sexual ritual or purely symbolic enactment, with evidence supporting both interpretations partially. Whatever its precise form, it represented the goal of Valentinian soteriology as union, marriage, and completion of divided beings sacramentally. The erotic and nuptial imagery pervading Valentinian texts expressed the intimate nature of the divine human reunion they sought ardently. The success of Valentinianism alarmed church leaders more than any other Gnostic movement because of its strategic sophistication uniquely. Valentinians used the same scriptures, attended the same services, and spoke the same religious language as their Orthodox neighbours seamlessly. Only in private meetings with advanced students did the esoteric interpretations distinguishing them from ordinary Christians emerge fully. Irenaeus compared them to wolves in sheep's clothing, appearing orthodox while secretly corrupting the faith from within dangerously. His massive work against heresies devoted more attention to refuting Valentinians than any other group precisely because of their threat level. They could not be easily identified, excluded or refuted because they occupied the same institutional and linguistic space as orthodoxy itself. The Valentinian school split into Eastern and Western branches after the founder's death, each developing distinctive emphases further. The Eastern school, associated with teachers like Theodotus, emphasized the more speculative and cosmological aspects of Valentinian teaching heavily. The Western school, including Ptolemy and Heraclion, focused more on scriptural interpretation and ethical application practically. Heraclion wrote the first known commentary on the Gospel of John, treating it as encoding Valentinian truths for those with understanding. Ptolemy's letter to Flora, preserved by Epiphanius, explained Valentinian views on the Old Testament law with remarkable sophistication and moderation. These diverse developments show Valentinianism's intellectual vitality and adaptability across different cultural contexts and emphases successfully. The eventual decline of Valentinianism resulted from both external suppression and internal limitations gradually accumulating over time. As Orthodox Christianity gained imperial support, institutional pressures against heterodox movements intensified throughout the 4th century decisively. The secret nature of advanced Valentinian teaching made transmission difficult once public presence became dangerous or impossible practically. The elaborate cosmological system, while intellectually satisfying, required extensive instruction that disrupted communities could not easily provide. By the 5th century, Valentinianism had essentially disappeared as a living tradition, preserved only in the writings of its opponents and buried texts. The Nag Hammadi discovery, including the Gospel of Truth, possibly written by Valentinus himself, partially restored voices silenced for 15 centuries. Part 7. Voices from the Jar. The discovery at Nag Hammadi in December 1945 transformed everything scholars thought they knew about Gnosticism fundamentally. For the first time, Gnostics could speak for themselves rather than being known only through hostile descriptions by their opponents. The cache contained 13 leather-bound codices, holding over 50 separate texts in Coptic translation from Greek originals. Many of these texts were completely unknown previously, having been lost for nearly 1600 years entirely. Others were known by name from church father references, but had never been read by any modern scholar before. The discovery ranks among the most significant archaeological finds for understanding ancient religion and early Christianity specifically. The circumstances of the discovery involved an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman, digging for fertilizer near cliffs. He and his brothers unearthed a large sealed jar that they initially feared might contain a jinn or evil spirit. Hoping instead for gold, they broke the jar open and found only old books, which they brought home disappointed initially. Their mother reportedly burned some pages as kindling before the text's significance was recognized by those who could read them. The subsequent history involved black market antiquities, dealing, scholarly intrigue, and decades of delayed publication frustratingly. The complete English translation did not appear until 1977, over 30 years after the initial discovery occurred. The codices were probably buried around 367 CE in response to a letter from Athanasius, the powerful bishop of Alexandria then. His Easter letter that year specified which books Christians should read and which they should reject as heretical and dangerous. Monks at the nearby Pachomian monastery may have hidden texts they valued but could no longer safely possess openly anymore. The jar's sealing preserved the papyrus pages through the subsequent centuries of Egyptian desert conditions remarkably well overall. This accidental preservation through deliberate concealment gave modern scholars access to voices that Orthodoxy had tried to silence permanently. The texts reveal a Gnosticism more diverse, more philosophically interesting, and more Christian than opponents' accounts had suggested previously. The Gospel of Thomas stands as the most famous and arguably most important text in the entire Nag Hammadi collection, unquestionably. It contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus with minimal narrative framework connecting them together at all loosely. Many sayings parallel material in the canonical Gospels, suggesting possible access to early Jesus traditions independently. Others are completely unique, presenting Jesus as a teacher of self-knowledge and divine presence within rather than external saviour. Saying 3 declares that the kingdom is inside you and outside you, and knowing yourself reveals your divine origin clearly. This emphasis on interior discovery rather than external salvation distinguishes Thomas from canonical gospel presentations significantly throughout. Whether Thomas should be classified as Gnostic remains debated among scholars who have studied its contents carefully over decades. It lacks the elaborate cosmological mythology of Scythian or Valentinian systems, with no Demiurge, archons or pleroma mentioned explicitly. Yet its emphasis on knowledge, self-discovery, and the divine spark within aligns with Gnostic soteriological concerns substantially. Some scholars argue Thomas represents an early form of Christianity that preceded and possibly influenced later Gnostic developments originally. Others see it as a simplified Gnosticism stripped of mythological elaboration for practical spiritual use among communities. The debate illuminates how fluid the boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy remained in earliest Christianity historically. The Secret Book of John, also called the Apocryphon of John, provides the most complete Scythian creation myth preserved anywhere. It presents itself as a secret revelation given by the risen Christ to the Apostle John after the resurrection privately. The text describes the unknowable Father, the emanation of Barbelo as first thought, and the generation of aeons systematically. It narrates Sophia's fall, the Demiurge Yaldabaoth's creation, the making of Adam, and the trapping of divine light comprehensively. 3 different copies were found at Nag Hammadi, plus one in a Berlin codex, indicating its importance to Gnostic communities widely. Irenaeus had described similar teachings in Against Heresies, and the discovery confirmed his account's basic accuracy surprisingly well. The Gospel of Truth, possibly written by Valentinus himself, offers a remarkably beautiful and moving meditation on salvation. Unlike mythological texts that narrate cosmic drama, it reflects philosophically on the experience of knowing and being known divinely. The text describes the human condition as a nightmare from which the Father awakens those who receive Gnosis lovingly. Error is personified but not demonized, treated as ignorance to be dissolved rather than enemy to be defeated violently. The prose style is poetic, almost hymnic, evoking religious experience rather than explaining cosmological mechanics systematically. It represents a contemplative strand of Gnosticism more concerned with transformation than with mythological information primarily. The reality of the rulers, also known as the hypostasis of the archons, retells Genesis from a Gnostic perspective deliberately. The archons who create Adam are exposed as ignorant cosmic powers, not the true God of ultimate reality whatsoever. The serpent who tempts Eve is presented as an agent of spiritual liberation, bringing knowledge against archonic prohibition helpfully. The female spiritual principle continually outsmarts the male archons, who try to capture and violate her repeatedly throughout. This text exemplifies how Gnostics read biblical narratives against their apparent meaning through radical allegorical reversal consistently. What seemed to be God's commands were actually the Demiurge's attempts to keep humanity ignorant and enslaved through false religion. The Thunder Perfect Mind presents one of the most enigmatic and haunting texts in the entire collection mysteriously. A feminine divine figure speaks in paradoxical self-declarations that embrace contradictory attributes simultaneously and defiantly throughout. She is the honoured one and the scorned one, the whore and the holy one, the wife and the virgin. She is knowledge and ignorance, strength and fear, war and peace, in an endless cascade of opposite identifications, dramatically. Scholars debate whether this represents Sophia, a Gnostic Eve, or some other divine feminine principle speaking through paradox. The text resists systematic interpretation, while evoking a feminine divine that transcends all categorical limitations absolutely and mysteriously. The Gospel of Philip, a Valentinian text, provides extensive reflection on sacraments and spiritual transformation practically applicable. It discusses baptism, chrism, Eucharist, redemption, and the bridal chamber as mysteries that transform the recipient spiritually. The text contains the famous passage about Jesus kissing Mary Magdalene, which provokes speculation about their relationship controversially. More importantly, it presents sacramental theology, where ritual actions accomplish real spiritual effects through symbolic power genuinely. The bridal chamber appears as the highest sacrament, uniting the soul with its angelic counterpart in spiritual marriage permanently. This ritual focus shows Gnosticism was not merely intellectual speculation, but embodied practice within functioning religious communities actually. The treatise on the resurrection addresses a topic that divided Gnostics from Orthodox Christians most sharply doctrinally. Written as a letter to someone named Reginos, it argues that resurrection is spiritual rather than physical in nature entirely. The fleshly body will not rise, because flesh is precisely what the spiritual person escapes through gnosis and death properly. True resurrection occurs when the divine spark awakens to its origin and destiny, which can happen even before physical death potentially. This realized eschatology contradicted Orthodox insistence on future bodily resurrection as Christianity's central hope for believers ultimately. The debate over resurrection's nature was among the most divisive issues separating Gnostic from Orthodox Christians throughout early centuries consistently. The texts discovered at Nag Hammadi represent only a fraction of what Gnostic communities produced over several centuries originally. They preserve mostly Scythian and Valentinian materials, with other schools like Basilidians represented poorly or not at all, unfortunately. The selection reflects the interests of whoever assembled this particular library, not the full range of Gnostic diversity comprehensively. Many texts are damaged, fragmentary, or preserved in only single copies, limiting comparative analysis possibilities significantly. Despite these limitations, the discovery fundamentally changed how scholars understand Gnosticism, early Christianity, and ancient religion generally. Voices silenced for nearly 2 millennia can now be heard, offering perspectives that Orthodoxy's triumph had erased almost completely from historical memory. The impact on scholarship has been profound and continues to unfold as researchers develop new approaches and interpretations constantly. The category of Gnosticism itself has been questioned, with some arguing it is a modern scholarly construct rather than ancient reality. The diversity revealed by the texts makes any single definition of Gnosticism problematic when applied across all materials universally. Some scholars now prefer to speak of Gnosis as a mode of religiosity rather than Gnosticism as a distinct religion simply. Others defend the category while acknowledging its limitations for describing the full range of phenomena involved historically. The debate itself demonstrates how the Nag Hammadi texts continue to stimulate fresh thinking about ancient religion productively today. Part 8. The Epistemology of Awakening. Gnosis was not ordinary knowledge that could be acquired through study, reasoning, or empirical observation conventionally understood. It was transformative recognition that fundamentally altered the knower's relationship to self, world, and ultimate reality completely. Understanding how Gnosis worked requires examining the phenomenology of spiritual knowledge as Gnostics themselves described experiencing it. This epistemology differed radically from Greek philosophical knowledge and from Christian faith as Orthodoxy defined them both. The Gnostic claimed a mode of knowing that transcended both rational demonstration and trustful belief entirely. Examining this claim reveals assumptions about consciousness, self, and reality that remain philosophically interesting today still. The Greek philosophical tradition distinguished several types of knowledge with different objects and methods carefully. Episteme was scientific knowledge, demonstrable through logical reasoning from first principles known through intuition or experience. Doxa was opinion or belief, less certain than episteme, but adequate for practical purposes in ordinary living situations. Nou was intellectual intuition, direct apprehension of truths too fundamental for discursive demonstration to establish indirectly. The Gnostics adopted Nou language, but transformed its meaning to indicate a salvific recognition rather than philosophical insight simply. Gnosis was nous applied to the self's divine origin, a knowing that was simultaneously a remembering of forgotten identity, crucially. The forgetting that Gnosis overcame was not accidental memory loss, but deliberate cosmic amnesia imposed by archonic powers. The Demiurge and his archons worked to keep humanity ignorant of its true divine nature through multiple mechanisms constantly. The physical body, with its needs and desires, distracted attention from the spiritual reality within continuously and effectively. Social institutions, including false religion, reinforced identification with the material world and bodily existence relentlessly throughout life. The sensory world presented itself as total reality, hiding the transcendent realm from which the divine spark had fallen originally. Awakening required breaking through this deliberately constructed ignorance to recover knowledge actively suppressed by cosmic powers. The experience of Gnosis was often described as sudden illumination rather than gradual learning over extended time periods. Like waking from sleep or recovering from intoxication, Gnosis transformed consciousness in a moment of breakthrough recognition dramatically. The Gospel of Truth compares the human condition to a nightmare from which the Father's call awakens the sleeping soul suddenly. This awakening reveals that what seemed real was illusion, and what was ignored was actually the only true reality existing. The Gnostic did not acquire new information, but recognized what had always been true, but was covered over by ignorance. This recognition brought liberation, because knowledge of one's divine nature automatically relativized the material world's apparent power completely. The content of Gnosis included several interrelated elements that together constituted salvific knowledge fully understood comprehensively. First was knowledge of the true God, the transcendent Father beyond the Demiurge who created and ruled this material cosmos. Second was knowledge of oneself as divine spark, a fragment of light temporarily trapped in matter but destined for return. Third was knowledge of how the present condition arose through cosmic catastrophe and archonic imprisonment, originally and historically. Fourth was knowledge of the way of return, the practices and passwords enabling the soul's ascent through hostile spheres after death. These elements formed an integrated salvific package where knowing any part fully implied understanding the whole system completely. The Gospel of Thomas expresses the epistemology of Gnosis in its opening lines with characteristic directness and power. It claims that whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death, promising immortality through understanding directly. Jesus says that those who seek should not stop until they find, and finding will disturb them initially and necessarily. After being disturbed, they will marvel, and marveling will lead to ruling over all and finding rest finally. This progression from seeking through disturbance to marvel and rest maps the phenomenology of transformative knowledge accurately. The disturbance comes from recognizing that everything one believed about reality and self was fundamentally mistaken comprehensively. The role of a teacher or revealer was crucial in triggering the recognition that constituted gnosis for most individuals typically. Christ functioned as the primary revealer in Christian Gnostic systems, descending from the pleroma to awaken sleeping sparks deliberately. His teaching provided the catalyst that activated latent knowledge already present within the pneumatic soul, potentially from its creation. The Gnostic teacher did not transfer information from one mind to another, as in ordinary education conventionally understood. Rather, the teacher's words or presence triggered recognition of what the student already knew but had forgotten through cosmic amnesia previously. This Socratic resonance with Plato's doctrine of recollection was not accidental, but reflected genuine philosophical influence on Gnostic epistemology. The experience of gnosis was often accompanied by intense emotional states that indicated its transformative depth and power. Joy at discovering one's divine origin replaced the despair of feeling trapped in a hostile material world permanently before. Fear of the archons dissolved as the Gnostic recognized their power was based on ignorance they could no longer maintain successfully. A sense of homecoming replaced alienation. As the spark recognized its origin in the pleroma, it would eventually rejoin permanently. These emotional transformations were not incidental to gnosis but constitutive of it as full experiential knowing genuinely. Knowledge that did not transform the knower emotionally and existentially was not true gnosis, but mere intellectual information only. Modern psychology offers potential frameworks for understanding what Gnostics described as gnosis in contemporary terms analytically. Carl Jung interpreted Gnostic experience as encounter with the collective unconscious and its archetypal contents manifesting symbolically. The divine spark corresponded to the self, the archetype of wholeness that the ego must recognize and integrate developmentally. The Demiurge represented the shadow side of the God image, the dark aspects of divinity that consciousness typically represses defensively. Jung saw Gnostics as ancient depth psychologists who projected inner realities onto cosmic screens in mythological form, expressively. Whether this psychological interpretation captures what Gnostics actually experienced or reduces, it remains debated among scholars still today. Cognitive science might describe gnosis as a radical shift in cognitive framing that reorganizes the interpretation of all experience fundamentally. Normally, consciousness operates within taken-for-granted frameworks that structure perception, memory, and meaning automatically and unconsciously. Transformative experiences can disrupt these frameworks, forcing consciousness to reorganize around new fundamental assumptions entirely and completely. The Gnostic framework positioned the material world as illusion and the divine spark as true self with comprehensive systematic thoroughness. Once this framework locked into place, all subsequent experience would be interpreted through its categories consistently and automatically. The sense of awakening might reflect the cognitive shift from one comprehensive framework to another, experienced as liberation dramatically. The phenomenology of gnosis also parallels reports of mystical experience across diverse religious traditions, transcultural patterns significantly. The sense of sudden illumination, of seeing through ordinary reality to something deeper, appears in mystical literature universally worldwide. The conviction that what is revealed is more real than ordinary experience characterizes mystical states across traditions consistently. The transformation of the experiencer's relationship to self and world follows from mystical breakthrough in most traditions similarly. Gnosticism may represent one culturally specific interpretation of a more universal type of human experience occurring across contexts. The mythological elaboration would then be secondary interpretation of primary experience available in different forms, elsewhere equally validly. The Gnostic epistemology raised serious questions that critics, both ancient and modern, have pressed against its coherence persistently. How could the Gnostic validate the claim to true knowledge against other competing claims to truth equally confidently asserted elsewhere? If Gnosis was self-authenticating, providing its own evidence through the experience itself, how could error be detected or corrected? The appeal to inner experience as criterion of truth opened the door to potentially unlimited divergent claims, all equally self-certified. Orthodox Christianity insisted on external criteria, scriptural and traditional, precisely to avoid the anarchy of private revelation endlessly proliferating. The tension between inner experience and external authority remains a fundamental problem for any epistemology of spiritual knowledge today, still. Part 9. Irenaeus and the Invention of Orthodoxy. Irenaeus of Lyon stands as the most important early Christian writer who systematically opposed Gnosticism in all its forms. His massive work against heresies, written around 180 CE, remains our most extensive ancient source on Gnostic teachings comprehensively. Before the Nag Hammadi discovery, scholars depended almost entirely on Irenaeus for knowledge of what Gnostics actually believed specifically. His work shaped how Christianity understood both itself and its heretical others for nearly 2 millennia, profoundly and persistently. Examining Irenaeus reveals not only anti-Gnostic arguments, but also how orthodoxy defined itself through opposition to heresy necessarily. The heretics, paradoxically, helped create the orthodoxy that condemned them through the very act of being condemned officially. Irenaeus was born around 130 CE in Smyrna, in the province of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey geographically. As a youth, he heard the aged bishop Polycarp, who claimed to have known the Apostle John personally and directly. This connection to apostolic witness through only one intermediary gave Irenaeus a powerful sense of authentic tradition inherited legitimately. He could claim that his teaching derived from eyewitnesses of Jesus through a short and verifiable chain of transmission clearly. Against Gnostic claims to secret teachings from apostles, Irenaeus asserted public teaching through known and acknowledged episcopal succession reliably. The appeal to verifiable succession became a cornerstone of orthodox self-definition against heretical pretensions to hidden knowledge strategically. Irenaeus moved to Gaul and became Bishop of Lyon after his predecessor Plotinus died during persecution around 177 CE. The church at Lyon was diverse, including Greek-speaking immigrants and Latin-speaking natives with varying levels of education and background. Gnostic teachers were active in the region, winning converts from Irenaeus's congregation through their claims to deeper spiritual knowledge attractively. His pastoral concern for souls being lost to what he considered deadly error motivated his extensive anti-heretical writing primarily. Against heresies was not abstract theological exercise, but urgent intervention to protect actual people from spiritual destruction immediately threatened. This pastoral motivation gave his arguments emotional force beyond their intellectual content, considered abstractly alone, separately. The structure of Against Heresies reveals Irenaeus's rhetorical strategy against his Gnostic opponents clearly and systematically throughout. The first two books describe Gnostic teachings in extensive detail, allowing readers to see their complexity and apparent absurdity directly. Irenaeus believed that simply exposing Gnostic doctrines would refute them, since their elaboration revealed their arbitrary and invented character obviously. He compared Gnostic myth-making to someone who disassembles a mosaic portrait of a king and reassembles the pieces as a dog. The pieces, individual scriptural texts, were genuine, but the picture made from them was a fraud, misrepresenting the original entirely. This image of heresy as distortion rather than invention acknowledged that Gnostics used real scriptural materials while producing false interpretations systematically. The remaining three books develop positive arguments for orthodox positions against Gnostic alternatives constructively and affirmatively throughout. Irenaeus argued that there is one God, creator and redeemer, not the divided divine realm Gnostics postulated with multiple deities separated. The God of the Old Testament and the Father of Jesus Christ are identical, not separate and opposed beings, as Gnostics claimed falsely. Creation is good, not the product of ignorance or malice, and matter will be redeemed, not escaped, as Gnostics taught erroneously. Jesus Christ was truly incarnate, truly suffered, and truly rose bodily against docetic denials of his material reality completely. Salvation comes through faith and participation in church sacraments, not through secret knowledge available only to a spiritual elite exclusively. The concept of apostolic succession that Irenaeus developed became fundamental to Orthodox ecclesiology for all subsequent centuries permanently. He argued that the apostles established churches and appointed bishops to succeed them in maintaining authentic teaching continuously. These bishops, especially in major sees like Rome, preserved the public teaching that could be verified against Gnostic private revelations definitely. Anyone could trace the episcopal succession and confirm that current bishops taught what the apostles had originally delivered publicly. The Gnostics, by contrast, could not demonstrate any verifiable connection between their supposed secret traditions and actual apostolic sources genuinely. Their claim to hidden teachings transmitted through private channels was inherently unverifiable and therefore untrustworthy compared to public succession clearly. Irenaeus gave special prominence to the Church at Rome in his argument for authentic tradition strategically and significantly. Every church must agree with Rome, he argued, because of its preeminent authority founded by Peter and Paul together jointly. This was not simply Roman ecclesiastical self-promotion, but recognition of Rome's role as guardian of apostolic teaching, universally acknowledged then. The Roman Church had resisted heretical infiltration and maintained sound doctrine against various challenges throughout its history successfully. Later, Catholic claims for papal authority would build on Irenaeus's arguments, though he himself did not articulate a developed papacy doctrine. His appeal to Roman authority established a precedent that would shape Western Christianity's institutional structure for centuries to come decisively. The rule of faith, or regula fidei, that Irenaeus articulated functioned as a summary of essential Christian belief against Gnostic distortions. This was not yet a formal creed, but an outline of basic doctrines that all Orthodox churches affirmed in common universally. It included one God as creator, Christ as truly incarnate Son, the Holy Spirit as sanctifier, bodily resurrection, and final judgment comprehensively. Any teaching that contradicted these elements could be identified as heretical regardless of its scriptural sophistication or philosophical elaboration impressively. The rule of faith provided a criterion for distinguishing true from false interpretation of Scripture that individual texts alone could not supply. Scripture required interpretation, and the rule of faith guided interpretation toward orthodox conclusions against Gnostic alternatives consistently. Irenaeus's theological contributions extended beyond anti-Gnostic polemic to positive doctrinal development that shaped Christianity permanently afterward. His concept of recapitulation described Christ as summing up and redoing the whole of human history and experience redemptively completely. Where Adam fell through disobedience, Christ succeeded through obedience, reversing the curse and restoring humanity's original purpose fully. This positive vision of salvation history contrasted sharply with Gnostic narratives of cosmic catastrophe requiring escape rather than restoration entirely. God's original creative purpose remained valid and would be fulfilled, not abandoned for some purely spiritual alternative divorced from material existence. Creation and redemption formed a unified plan, not the mistake and correction that Gnostic systems imagined between a false creator and true redeemer. The irony of Irenaeus's achievement is that heresy helped create orthodoxy as much as orthodoxy created heresy reciprocally. Without the Gnostic challenge, the Church would not have needed to define its boundaries so clearly or articulate its positions so precisely. The threat of alternative Christianities forced Orthodox leaders to specify what counted as authentic faith versus dangerous deviation explicitly. Canon, creed, and episcopacy all developed in part as responses to Gnostic challenges that required institutional and doctrinal clarification urgently. Irenaeus did not simply defeat an enemy. He helped construct the orthodoxy that could identify and exclude enemies definitively thereafter. The category of heresy itself, as deviation from an established norm, required an established norm that anti-heretical work simultaneously produced. Modern scholarship has both confirmed and complicated Irenaeus's portrayal of Gnosticism in various ways through ongoing research continuously. The Nag Hammadi texts showed that his descriptions of Gnostic teachings were generally accurate in their basic content, surprisingly fairly. He had access to Gnostic texts and reproduced their doctrines with reasonable fidelity, despite his hostile interpretive framing throughout his work. However, his claim that all Gnostic groups derived from a single source in Simon Magus was polemical simplification, not historical accuracy, genuinely. The diversity revealed by the texts shows Gnosticism as a complex phenomenon that no single genealogy can explain adequately comprehensively. Irenaeus created a useful category for his polemical purposes that scholars now recognize was more diverse than his portrayal suggested originally. The legacy of Irenaeus extends through all subsequent Christian history in ways both visible and hidden, continuously operating throughout. His arguments established patterns of anti-heretical reasoning that the Church would deploy against countless subsequent deviations repeatedly for centuries. His emphasis on apostolic succession, scriptural canon, and rule of faith became permanent features of Christian institutional and doctrinal structure universally. Even Protestant reformers who rejected some aspects of his ecclesiology inherited his basic framework for distinguishing orthodoxy from heresy operatively. The very concept of heresy, as he articulated it, shaped how Western culture has thought about deviant belief and dangerous ideas broadly. Irenaeus did not merely oppose Gnosticism. He helped create the conceptual apparatus through which Christianity would think about itself for millennia afterward. Part 10. Body as prison, body as temple. The human body occupied a deeply ambivalent position in Gnostic thought that generated conflicting practical responses among communities. If matter was the product of cosmic catastrophe, then the body was literally made from crystallized divine suffering and error. The flesh encased the divine spark like a prison cell, limiting its perception and binding it to cycles of material existence. Yet the body also contained that spark, making it the location where salvation must be worked out practically and experientially. This tension between body as prison and body as container of divinity produced divergent ethical conclusions among different Gnostic groups. Understanding these divergent responses reveals the practical implications of Gnostic cosmology for lived human experience directly. The ascetic response to embodiment followed logically from the premise that matter entraps spirit through desire and attachment constantly. If bodily appetites bind the spark more tightly to material existence, then denying those appetites loosens the binding systematically. Fasting weakened the body's hold on consciousness and demonstrated the spirit's superiority over flesh's demands continuously. Sexual abstinence prevented the creation of new bodies that would trap additional divine sparks in matter perpetually. Withdrawal from worldly activities reduced entanglement with the archonic systems designed to keep humanity distracted and ignorant permanently. The ascetic Gnostic lived as if already freed from the body while still technically inhabiting it, temporarily awaiting final release. Some Gnostic texts describe the body in terms of violent disgust that exceed mere philosophical detachment significantly and dramatically. The Testimony of Truth calls the body a corpse, animated only by the divine spark that the ignorant mistake for life itself. Other texts describe the body as a garment of shame, clothing forced upon the naked divine spark against its will humiliatingly. The bodily functions of eating, excretion, and reproduction receive particular scorn as evidence of matter's degradation and corruption. This visceral rejection of embodiment expressed existential alienation that philosophical language alone could not adequately convey emotionally. The body was not merely inferior, but actively repulsive to the awakened Gnostic, who recognized its true nature as prison cell. The libertine response drew opposite practical conclusions from the same cosmological premises through different logical reasoning equally validly. If the body is merely a prison and its actions cannot affect the divine spark within, then bodily behavior is spiritually irrelevant completely. The Demiurge's moral laws were designed to control humanity, not to reflect genuine spiritual truths about right action meaningfully. Breaking those laws demonstrated freedom from archonic control and contempt for the false god's illegitimate authority over pneumatics specifically. Sexual libertinism, dietary indulgence, and social transgression could all function as spiritual exercises in liberation from conventional restraints deliberately. The pneumatic spark remained pure regardless of what the body did, since its nature was divine and incorruptible eternally by definition. Church Fathers seized upon reports of Gnostic libertinism as evidence of the movement's moral corruption and dangerous social consequences publicly. Irenaeus described Gnostic groups allegedly practicing ritual sexuality and consuming bodily fluids as sacramental acts, shockingly to Orthodox sensibilities. Epiphanius provided even more lurid accounts of Gnostic sexual rituals that scholars debate as possibly exaggerated or invented polemically entirely. Whether these accounts reflect actual practices or hostile fantasy remains uncertain given the polemical context of our sources predominantly. The Nag Hammadi texts themselves tend toward asceticism rather than libertinism in their ethical orientation consistently throughout the collection. This may indicate that ascetic Gnosticism was more common, or simply that ascetic texts were more likely to be preserved by monks specifically. The Gnostic understanding of gender complicated attitudes toward the body further, with implications that remain debated among scholars intensely. The divine realm contained both masculine and feminine principles united in syzygies, pairs of complementary aeons together harmoniously balanced. Sophia's fall resulted partly from acting without her masculine counterpart, disrupting the balance that maintained pleromatic harmony previously. Some texts suggested that salvation involved transcending gender division, returning to an original androgynous state before differentiation occurred cosmically. The Gospel of Thomas controversially concludes with Jesus promising to make Mary male so she can enter the kingdom of heaven. This saying has generated extensive debate about whether it reflects misogyny, gender transcendence, or symbolic spiritual transformation variously interpreted. Women played significant roles in some Gnostic communities that exceeded what Orthodox churches typically permitted them institutionally or ritually. The Gospel of Mary presents Mary Magdalene as a leading disciple who received special revelation that male apostles initially rejected skeptically. She comforts the grieving disciples and teaches them what Jesus had revealed to her privately in visionary experience authoritatively. Peter objects that Jesus would not have shared such teachings with a woman rather than with his male disciples preferentially. Levi defends Mary, and the text implicitly critiques the emerging patriarchal structure of Orthodox Christianity through this narrative tension clearly. Whether Gnostic communities actually accorded women greater roles or simply employed feminine imagery symbolically remains historically uncertain conclusively. The divine feminine, particularly Sophia and Barbelo, occupied positions of cosmological importance that contrasted with masculine dominance in Orthodox theology significantly. Sophia was responsible for the cosmic drama's central event, and her redemption was essential to the restoration of all things finally. Barbelo, in Sethian texts, was the first emanation from the Father, the divine thought that preceded all subsequent aeons originally. The feminine was thus not subordinate but constitutive of divinity itself at its highest levels of pleromatic existence fundamentally. This theological prominence of the feminine may have attracted women to Gnostic communities or reflected existing female participation in them sociologically. The relationship between theological symbolism and social reality in Gnostic communities remains an area of ongoing scholarly investigation and debate. The concept of the pneumatic seed or divine spark raised questions about its relationship to ordinary psychological faculties philosophically complex. Valentinians distinguished three components in the human being: the material body, the psychic soul, and the pneumatic spirit distinctly separately. The soul was not itself divine, but the animating principle that the Demiurge breathed into the material body at creation originally. It could choose to follow either bodily impulses downward or spiritual promptings upward, making it the locus of moral decision importantly. The spirit or divine spark was not subject to choice, but was simply present in pneumatics, awaiting recognition and liberation eventually. This tripartite anthropology created complex relationships between will, nature, and destiny that different Gnostic schools elaborated variously throughout their texts. The question of whether all humans possess divine sparks or only some divided Gnostic schools and troubled their orthodox critics significantly. Valentinian classification into helics, psychics, and pneumatics implied that spiritual capacity was innate rather than universally distributed equally across humanity. Helics apparently lacked any possibility of salvation regardless of their beliefs or behavior, being purely material in constitution entirely. This spiritual predestination contradicted the emerging Orthodox emphasis on salvation offered to all through faith in Christ, universally available. It also raised troubling questions about divine justice if some were created incapable of salvation through no fault of their own inherently. Critics charged that Gnostic elitism was morally objectionable precisely because it denied equal spiritual opportunity to all human beings, fundamentally. The practical disciplines Gnostics employed to cultivate Gnosis and prepare for the soul's ascent varied across communities and traditions significantly. Meditation on mythological narratives could dissolve identification with the material self and awaken recognition of the divine spark within, gradually. Ritual practices, including baptism, anointing, and the bridal chamber, enacted the salvation they symbolize through sacred performance powerfully. Learning passwords and formulas that would enable passage through archonic spheres after death was essential practical knowledge for successful ascent. Some groups practiced techniques resembling what we would now call visualization, imagining the ascent through cosmic levels while still embodied preparatorily. These practices aimed at experiential transformation, not merely intellectual understanding of doctrines about cosmic structure and human destiny abstractly. The Gnostic body was thus simultaneously despised and instrumental, rejected as prison, yet employed as vehicle for spiritual practice paradoxically. Even the most ascetic Gnostic could not simply escape the body, but had to work within its conditions until death released the spark. The body's senses could receive teachings, its voice could recite formulas, its participation in ritual could effect sacramental transformation, genuinely. This pragmatic accommodation of embodiment existed in tension with the theoretical rejection of matter that cosmological doctrines articulated systematically. Living in a body while believing the body to be a prison required psychological negotiations that different individuals and communities managed differently. The range of practical responses, from extreme asceticism to libertine indulgence, reflected this fundamental tension within Gnostic anthropology itself inherently. Part 11. Mani and the Light Religion. Manichaeism represents the most successful Gnostic movement in world historical terms, spreading across 3 continents over a millennium impressively. Founded by the Persian prophet Mani in the 3rd century CE, it synthesized Gnostic, Christian, Zoroastrian, and Buddhist elements systematically, comprehensively. At its height, Manichaean communities existed from the Roman Empire to China, making it a genuinely universal religion, geographically unprecedented. The movement attracted brilliant adherents, including the young Augustine of Hippo before his conversion to Orthodox Christianity, eventually permanently. Understanding Manichaeism reveals how Gnostic ideas could be systematized into a complete religious institution with lasting historical impact significantly. Its rise and fall illuminate both the appeal and the vulnerabilities of Gnostic religion when organized on a large scale institutionally. Mani was born in 216 CE in Mesopotamia, into a family belonging to the Elchasite Jewish Christian baptizing sect originally. He reported receiving revelations from a heavenly twin or divine counterpart beginning at age 12 and culminating at age 24, decisively. These visions revealed to him the true nature of reality and commissioned him as the final prophet, completing all previous revelations historically. Mani saw himself as the paraclete promised by Jesus, the seal of the prophets who brought definitive truth to humanity finally. His self-understanding combined Christian, Zoroastrian and Buddhist prophetic categories into a universal mission transcending any single tradition's boundaries deliberately. He presented his teaching not as new religion, but as the fulfillment and purification of all authentic religion previously revealed partially. The Manichaean cosmology began with an absolute dualism between 2 eternal principles that had always existed and always would exist. The kingdom of light, ruled by the Father of greatness, was purely good, spiritual, and characterized by peace and harmony eternally. The kingdom of darkness, ruled by the Prince of Darkness, was purely evil, material, and characterized by chaos and conflict eternally. These 2 realms originally existed separately, with the boundary between them preventing any contact or contamination between principles absolutely. The cosmic drama began when darkness became aware of light and attacked it, driven by its inherently aggressive and acquisitive nature, instinctually. This unprovoked aggression initiated the tragic mixing of light and darkness that defines our present cosmic situation continuously still. The Father of Greatness responded to the attack not with counter-aggression, but with a salvific strategy of apparent defeat cleverly designed. He called forth the primal man, a divine being who descended to the boundary to defend light against the invading darkness heroically. The primal man was defeated and swallowed by darkness, but this was part of the divine plan rather than genuine catastrophe strategically. His light became mixed with dark matter, acting like poison within darkness, while simultaneously providing the material for creation importantly. The visible cosmos was constructed by divine powers to extract this swallowed light gradually through cosmic processes, operating over immense time periods. The sun and moon function as ships that collect liberated light particles and transport them back to the kingdom of light continuously. Human beings contain significant concentrations of trapped light that make their salvation particularly important in the cosmic drama centrally. The soul is light, the body is darkness, and human existence is the primary battleground where light must be separated from darkness individually. Every human action either liberates light, allowing it to ascend toward its source, or binds it more tightly in matter destructively. This gave Manichaean ethics cosmic significance, since individual moral choices affected the universal process of light liberation directly and measurably. The Manichaean lived with constant awareness that their behavior participated in a cosmic drama vastly larger than their individual concerns personally. This sense of cosmic participation gave meaning to everyday choices that might otherwise seem trivial or insignificant spiritually and morally. Manichaean community structure divided members into two classes with radically different obligations and spiritual statuses clearly distinguished hierarchically. The elect were the spiritual elite who followed strict ascetic disciplines designed to maximize light liberation through their perfected lives constantly. They ate only vegetables, avoided killing anything, remained celibate, owned no property, and spent their time in prayer and teaching exclusively. Their digestion was believed to liberate light from the food they consumed, making eating itself a sacramental act of cosmic purification genuinely. The hearers were lay supporters who could not follow such strict disciplines, but served the elect and would be reborn as elect eventually. This two-tier system allowed the religion to accommodate different levels of commitment while maintaining its rigorous spiritual ideal practically workably. Mani himself was executed around 276 CE by the Persian authorities after a period of initial tolerance turned to persecution violently. His death became martyrdom in Manichaean memory, confirming his status as prophet and sealing his teaching with his blood sacrificially dramatically. The religion survived and spread despite persecution, moving westward into the Roman Empire and eastward along the Silk Road into Central Asia successfully. Manichaean missionaries proved remarkably adaptable, presenting their teaching in Christian terms in the West and Buddhist terms in the East strategically. This adaptability reflected Mani's own synthetic vision that saw all genuine religion as partial expressions of the one truth he fully revealed. The same Manichaean text could be translated to emphasize whichever vocabulary would resonate most with local audiences effectively and deliberately. Augustine of Hippo spent 9 years as a Manichaean hearer before his conversion to Christianity, an experience that profoundly shaped his mature theology. He was attracted initially by Manichaeism's rational explanation of evil, which avoided making God responsible for the world's suffering logically elegantly. The dualistic solution located evil in an independent principle, darkness, that God neither created nor could be blamed for philosophically satisfyingly. This addressed a problem that troubled Augustine deeply. How could a good God create a world containing so much pain and wickedness reasonably? His eventual rejection of Manichaeism came partly from disillusionment with Manichaean teachers who could not answer his philosophical questions adequately satisfactorily. His later theology developed in conscious opposition to Manichaean positions he knew intimately from the inside through extensive personal experience directly. Augustine's anti-Manichaean writings became foundational for Western Christian thought on creation, evil, free will, and grace permanently influentially. He argued that evil is not a substance or independent principle, but the privation or absence of good in what should possess it. God did not create evil. Rather, creatures with free will chose to turn away from God, creating evil through their own defection voluntarily. This solution preserved divine goodness and omnipotence while locating responsibility for evil in creaturely choice rather than cosmic structure ultimately. Augustine's famous formulation that evil is privatio boni, privation of good, became standard Western theology against any Gnostic or dualist alternative definitively. His personal journey from Manichaeism through skepticism to Orthodox Christianity became a paradigm for conversion narratives in Western literature, broadly, influentially. Manichaeism proved remarkably persistent, despite centuries of persecution from both Christian and Zoroastrian authorities determined to eliminate it completely. In the Roman Empire, imperial edicts banned Manichaean practice, prescribed burning of their books, and mandated execution for their leaders repeatedly harshly. These persecutions drove the movement underground, but did not eliminate it, as evidenced by its continued condemnation in later centuries persistently. In Persia, the Zoroastrian establishment viewed Manichaeism as a dangerous corruption of their own tradition, requiring vigorous suppression urgently necessarily. The movement found more tolerant conditions along the Silk Road, where it flourished among Central Asian peoples for centuries, successfully, extensively. The Uyghur Khaganate even adopted Manichaeism as state religion in 762 CE, a unique instance of Gnostic political establishment historically remarkably. The final survival of Manichaeism occurred in China, where communities persisted until at least the 14th century before finally disappearing completely eventually. Chinese Manichaean texts discovered in the 20th century revealed how the religion adapted to East Asian cultural contexts while maintaining core doctrines intact. Buddhist terminology and imagery clothed Manichaean cosmology in forms acceptable and comprehensible to Chinese audiences unfamiliar with Western categories naturally. The Buddha of Light was identified with Mani, and Manichaean practice was presented as a path to enlightenment in Buddhist terms, strategically skillfully. This successful adaptation demonstrated both the flexibility of Manichaean missionary strategy and the translatability of Gnostic concepts across cultural boundaries impressively. The religion that Mani founded outlasted its founder by over 1,000 years, testimony to the enduring appeal of its vision globally, historically. Part 12. The Mandaean Survival. The Mandaeans represent the only Gnostic religion that has survived continuously from antiquity to the present day, remarkably astonishingly. Living primarily in southern Iraq and southwestern Iran until recent decades, they maintained traditions spanning nearly 2,000 years, persistently faithfully. Their name derives from the Aramaic word manda, meaning knowledge, directly connecting them to the Gnostic emphasis on gnosis, terminologically explicitly. Modern persecution and war have scattered Mandaean communities to Australia, Europe and North America as refugees fleeing violence, tragically dispersingly. Studying living Mandaeans provides unique opportunities to understand how Gnostic religion functions as ongoing practice rather than historical artifact only academically. Their survival against extraordinary odds testifies to the resilience of Gnostic spirituality and community under conditions of constant external pressure remarkably. Mandaean origins remain debated among scholars, with claims ranging from pre-Christian Palestinian roots to later Mesopotamian development variously proposed academically. The Mandaeans themselves claimed descent from followers of John the Baptist, who rejected Jesus and maintained their original baptizing practice continuously. John the Baptist holds an honoured position in Mandaean tradition, though they deny that he was merely a forerunner of Jesus theologically distinctively. Jesus himself appears in some Mandaean texts as a false prophet who distorted the true teaching that John had represented authentically originally. This anti-Christian polemic may reflect later boundary maintenance against the dominant religion of their environment rather than historical origins genuinely accurately. Regardless of their actual origins, Mandaeans have maintained distinct identity for centuries despite pressure from surrounding Muslim and Christian majorities constantly. The Mandaean cosmology shares essential features with other Gnostic systems while displaying distinctive characteristics unique to their tradition, particularly. The supreme deity, called the King of Light or Great Life, exists in a realm of light utterly separate from the material world below entirely. Below this transcendent deity exist intermediate beings, some beneficial and some harmful, who interact with the material realm and humanity constantly actively. The material world was created by a demiurgic figure called Ptahil, whose creation was flawed and who sometimes appears as ignorant or foolish characteristically. The human soul is a spark of light trapped in the material body, seeking eventual liberation and return to the world of light, ultimately, hopefully. These structural parallels with other Gnostic systems confirm the family resemblance while allowing for significant variation in narrative details, particularly. Baptism, called masbuta, stands at the center of Mandaean religious practice, performed repeatedly throughout a Mandaean's life, regularly, continually. Unlike Christian baptism performed once, Mandaean baptism is repeated on Sundays and at various life transitions and purification occasions, frequently, regularly. The ritual requires living or flowing water, originally rivers, connecting participants to the cosmic waters that flow from the world of light above. The priest, called a Tarmida, performs elaborate ritual actions including triple immersion, signing and drinking of water ceremonially, carefully. The ritual dress of pure white garments symbolizes the luminous garments of light that souls will wear in the heavenly realm, eventually, finally. This centrality of water ritual connects Mandaeanism to its claimed Baptist origins, whatever the historical accuracy of that connection actually genuinely. The Mandaean priesthood maintains elaborate traditions of ritual knowledge passed down through generations within priestly families continuously carefully. Becoming a priest requires extensive training in the Mandaic language, ritual procedures, and theological knowledge transmitted orally and textually, comprehensively, thoroughly. The highest priestly rank, Rish Amma, or head of the people, holds authority over all other priests and community affairs, importantly centrally. Priestly succession has sometimes faced crises when qualified candidates were lacking due to persecution, war, or community disruption, problematically. The survival of the priesthood ensures the survival of authentic ritual practice, making priestly continuity essential to Mandaean religious persistence, historically, fundamentally. Modern diaspora conditions have challenged but not yet broken the chain of priestly succession, maintaining traditional practice authentically, legitimately, continuously. Mandaean scripture includes several texts, the most important being the Ginza Rabbah, or Great Treasury, containing mythological and ritual material extensively comprehensively. Written in Mandaic, a dialect of Aramaic, these texts preserve linguistic and religious traditions of great antiquity, valuable for scholarly study, importantly significantly. The Ginza divides into right and left sections, dealing respectively with theological matters and the soul's journey after death, specifically distinctively. Other important texts include the Book of John, focused on John the Baptist, and the Colaster, a collection of prayers and hymns ritually used. These scriptures were transmitted in manuscript form by priestly copyists who preserved them through centuries of sometimes hostile conditions, faithfully, carefully. Modern publication of these texts has made Mandaean literature accessible to scholars studying Gnosticism and ancient religion broadly, more widely accessibly. The Mandaean understanding of death and the afterlife elaborates the Gnostic theme of the soul's ascent through hostile spheres in particular detail, specifically. At death, the soul must journey through purgatories or watchhouses where it is tested, purified or detained, depending on its earthly life carefully. The prayers recited for the dead and the rituals performed by the living assist the soul in making this difficult passage successfully helpfully. Eventually, the purified soul reaches the world of light and receives the luminous body it will inhabit eternally, blissfully, permanently. The elaborate death rituals, extending over days after physical death, demonstrate the seriousness with which Mandaeans approach the soul's transition, carefully, thoroughly. These rituals require priestly performance, another reason why the priesthood's survival is essential to authentic Mandaean religious practice, fundamentally crucially. Modern Mandaeans face unprecedented challenges to their survival as a distinct religious community globally due to recent historical catastrophes devastatingly seriously. The Iraq War, beginning in 2003, and subsequent sectarian violence targeted Mandaeans specifically who lacked the militia protection other religious minorities possessed vulnerably defensively. Many fled to Syria, only to face renewed violence when civil war erupted there, forcing further migration to uncertain destinations, repeatedly traumatically. Diaspora communities in Australia, Sweden and elsewhere struggle to maintain traditions designed for compact communities with access to flowing rivers practically difficultly. Performing authentic masbuta in chlorinated municipal pools or indoor facilities challenges ritual requirements developed over millennia in different environmental conditions problematically. The question of whether Mandaeanism can survive dispersion and modernization remains open, with community members actively debating adaptation versus preservation urgently, seriously. Scholars studying Mandaeanism gain unique insights into how a Gnostic religion actually functioned as lived practice across generations, continuously, historically. The text alone cannot reveal the experiential dimensions of repeated baptism, communal meals, and ritual performance that constitute religious life, actually concretely. Observing and interviewing living Mandaeans provides access to insider perspectives unavailable for extinct Gnostic movements known only through hostile ancient sources limitedly. Comparative analysis reveals both continuities and differences between Mandaean and other Gnostic traditions, illuminating the range of Gnostic possibility historically, theoretically. The Mandaean example shows that Gnostic religion can sustain community across centuries without the institutional resources of larger religions remarkably impressively. Their survival under conditions of constant marginality demonstrates resilience that scholarly focus on Gnosticism's ancient defeat has sometimes obscured from recognition properly. Part 13. Underground Rivers. The suppression of Gnosticism in late antiquity did not entirely eliminate Gnostic ideas from Western religious and intellectual history completely. Themes, concepts, and attitudes recognizably Gnostic resurfaced repeatedly throughout the medieval and early modern periods in various guises, unexpectedly, persistently. Whether these represent genuine continuity of tradition or independent reinvention of perennial human intuitions remains debated among historians inconclusively, endlessly. The metaphor of underground rivers captures this phenomenon. Streams of thought flowing beneath the surface, occasionally emerging into visibility unexpectedly surprisingly. Tracing these subterranean currents reveals how Gnostic sensibilities persisted despite official suppression by both church and state authorities systematically, comprehensively. The very effort to eliminate Gnosticism may have ensured its survival by driving it into hidden forms that escape direct detection successfully, cleverly. The Paulicians emerged in Armenia during the 7th century, teaching a dualism that distinguished the evil creator of matter from the good God of spirit sharply, clearly. They rejected the Old Testament as the product of the evil principle and honored Paul as the apostle who understood true Christianity correctly, distinctively. Their rejection of material sacraments, icons, and elaborate church hierarchy echoed ancient Gnostic themes about matter's spiritual worthlessness consistently, characteristically. Byzantine authorities persecuted Paulicians violently, including mass executions and forced deportations to the Balkans during the 8th and 9th centuries, extensively harshly. These deportations inadvertently spread Paulician ideas westward, where they would influence subsequent dualist movements in southeastern Europe significantly, importantly. The Paulician example shows how persecution can spread rather than contain the ideas it aims to eliminate, paradoxically, counterproductively. The Bogomils arose in Bulgaria during the 10th century, developing a dualist theology with clear similarities to both Paulicianism and ancient Gnosticism, recognizably, distinctively. Their founder, a priest named Bogomil, meaning beloved of God, taught that Satan created the material world and trapped human souls within it, cosmologically. The God of the New Testament sent Christ to teach humanity how to escape Satan's material prison through ascetic practice and spiritual knowledge, redemptively, salvifically. Bogomils rejected church hierarchy, sacraments, and material religious objects as belonging to Satan's realm, rather than God's kingdom, critically, radically. Their simple ascetic lifestyle and egalitarian community structure appealed to peasants, and some nobles, dissatisfied with the established church's wealth and corruption, attractively, appealingly. Bogomil missionaries spread their teaching westward into Italy and France, where it would take new forms in the Cathar movement, subsequently influentially. The Cathars, also called Albigensians, from the southern French town of Albi, represented the most significant medieval dualist movement in Western Europe, historically importantly. Flourishing in southern France and northern Italy during the 12th and 13th centuries, they posed a serious challenge to Catholic Church authority regionally significantly. Cathar theology distinguished between a good God who created spirits and an evil God who created matter in clear dualist fashion, characteristically. The material world, including the human body, was the evil god's prison for divine souls awaiting liberation through Cathar teaching and practice specifically. Their perfecti, the spiritual elite who had received the consolamentum initiation, practiced strict asceticism, including vegetarianism and celibacy, rigorously, completely. Ordinary believers could live normal lives, but sought the consolamentum before death to ensure their soul's liberation from material rebirth, finally, ultimately. The Catholic Church responded to the Cathar challenge with unprecedented violence through the Albigensian Crusade launched in 1209, devastatingly, brutally. Northern French nobles, motivated by both religious zeal and desire for southern lands, invaded the Languedoc region, with papal blessing, enthusiastically, aggressively. The war lasted decades, destroying cities, massacring populations, and eventually breaking Cathar political and military resistance completely, thoroughly, comprehensively. The Inquisition, established partly to root out remaining Cathars, pursued suspected heretics for generations after the Crusade ended officially formally. By the 14th century, Catharism had been effectively eliminated as an organized movement, though isolated believers may have persisted longer secretly, quietly. The destruction of Catharism demonstrated the lengths to which established religion would go to eliminate perceived Gnostic threats violently, completely, thoroughly. The question of whether Catharism derived from ancient Gnosticism through continuous transmission or reinvented Gnostic themes independently remains historically contested, debatably, uncertainly. Some scholars trace a line of influence from Paulicians through Bogomils to Cathars, suggesting genuine continuity of dualist tradition across centuries historically. Others argue that similar social and spiritual conditions can independently generate similar religious responses without requiring direct transmission necessarily causally. The structural similarities between Cathar and ancient Gnostic teachings are striking, but could reflect parallel solutions to perennial problems, alternatively possibly. The truth likely involves both factors. Some genuine transmission of ideas combined with independent reinvention based on similar dissatisfactions and intuitions complexly. Medieval dualism, whether continuous or reinvented, demonstrates the persistent appeal of Gnostic explanations for evil and suffering across different historical contexts. Jewish Kabbalah, the mystical tradition that emerged in medieval Provence and Spain, contains elements that some scholars have connected to ancient Gnosticism intriguingly suggestively. The Kabbalistic concept of Tzimtzum describes God contracting within himself to create space for creation in language reminiscent of Gnostic emanation, strikingly parallelly. The Sephirot, divine attributes through which God manifests and acts, resemble the aeons of Gnostic pleroma structurally, functionally, significantly. The breaking of the vessels, which scattered divine sparks throughout creation, parallels Gnostic accounts of light trapped in matter thematically, symbolically, closely. Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Kabbalah, argued for Gnostic influences on Jewish mysticism, though this thesis remains debated academically controversially. Whether influence, parallel development, or coincidental similarity best explains these resemblances continues to generate scholarly discussion, productively, inconclusively still. The Hermetic tradition, based on texts attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, transmitted Gnostic and quasi-Gnostic ideas through medieval and Renaissance Europe continuously, influentially. The Corpus Hermeticum, rediscovered in the 15th century, presented a cosmology and soteriology with clear Gnostic resonances, attractively, compellingly, intellectually. The human soul was divine in origin, trapped in matter, and capable of ascent through knowledge to reunion with its source redemptively, hopefully. Renaissance thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola embraced Hermetic teachings as ancient wisdom, predating and confirming Christian truth enthusiastically, eagerly. This Hermetic revival influenced alchemy, astrology, and early modern science in ways that continue to transmit transformed Gnostic themes widely, broadly. The Hermetic motto, as above, so below, encoded correspondences between macrocosm and microcosm, central to Gnostic and esoteric thought, characteristically distinctively. Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, and other esoteric movements of the early modern period incorporated themes and symbols with Gnostic resonances into their initiatory systems, distinctively, characteristically. The emphasis on secret knowledge, revealed through graduated initiation, echoed the Gnostic claim to Gnosis unavailable to the uninitiated masses, parallelly similarly. Symbols of light versus darkness, ascent through levels, and liberation through knowledge pervaded these movements' rituals and teachings pervasively, extensively. Whether these movements had actual historical connections to ancient Gnosticism or simply developed parallel structures, independently remains unclear historically, uncertainly. Their influence on Western esotericism, however, ensured that Gnostic-like themes remained available for appropriation by later spiritual seekers continuously, persistently. The underground rivers of Gnostic sensibility continued flowing into the modern period through these and other channels, steadily, continuously, perpetually. Part 14. Jung, Jonas, and the Gnostic modern. The 20th century witnessed a remarkable revival of scholarly and popular interest in Gnosticism, driven by major intellectual figures importantly, significantly. Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychologist, found in Gnostic texts anticipations of his own depth, psychology concepts strikingly, compellingly, clearly. Hans Jonas, the philosopher, used Gnosticism to diagnose modern existentialism and nihilism as spiritual diseases, with ancient precedents, insightfully, brilliantly. Eric Voegelin, the political philosopher, applied Gnostic categories to analyze modern revolutionary ideologies as dangerous spiritual disorders, controversially, provocatively. These thinkers transformed Gnosticism from antiquarian curiosity into a lens for understanding modernity itself and its discontents profoundly, illuminatingly. Their interpretations, while contested, established Gnosticism's relevance for contemporary thought beyond merely historical interest, importantly, lastingly. Jung's engagement with Gnosticism began early in his career and deepened throughout his life, continuously, intensively, comprehensively. He wrote the 7 Sermons to the Dead in 1916, a Gnostic-style text that he later described as emerging from his unconscious, spontaneously, autonomously. The text presents a cosmology remarkably similar to Valentinian Gnosticism, with a supreme deity called Abraxas, combining all opposites paradoxically, mysteriously. Jung later interpreted this early work as evidence that Gnostic symbols represented archetypal contents of the collective unconscious manifesting spontaneously, universally. If the same symbols emerged in ancient Gnostics and modern Swiss psychiatrists, they must reflect something fundamental about the human psyche, structurally, inherently. This conclusion made Gnosticism not merely historically interesting, but psychologically essential for understanding the depths of human consciousness scientifically, therapeutically. Jung developed extensive parallels between Gnostic mythology and his psychological concepts throughout his mature writings, systematically, comprehensively, thoroughly. The pleroma corresponded to the collective unconscious, the vast reservoir of archetypal patterns underlying individual consciousness, universally, fundamentally, structurally. The divine spark corresponded to the self, the archetype of wholeness that the ego must recognize and integrate through individuation, developmentally, therapeutically. The Demiurge represented the shadow side of the God image, the dark aspects of divinity that consciousness typically represses and projects externally, defensively. Sophia's fall and restoration paralleled the individuation process, where consciousness descends into unconscious depths before achieving higher integration, eventually successfully. Jung saw Gnostics as ancient depth psychologists who projected inner realities onto cosmic screens in mythological form, intuitively, presciently, accurately. Jung's interpretation proved enormously influential in shaping how popular audiences understood and appropriated Gnostic ideas throughout the 20th century, broadly, extensively. His books, lectures, and the spread of Jungian analysis made Gnostic concepts accessible to readers who would never study ancient texts directly, independently, academically. The idea that knowing oneself deeply was spiritually salvific resonated with modern individualism and therapeutic culture perfectly harmoniously, compatibly, appealingly. Jung provided a framework for taking Gnosticism seriously without requiring literal belief in its cosmological claims, metaphysically, theologically, traditionally. One could be a modern scientific person and still find Gnostic symbols meaningful as expressions of psychological rather than cosmic realities practically usefully. This psychologized Gnosticism became widely influential in New Age spirituality, transpersonal psychology, and popular self-help movements extensively, pervasively, broadly. Hans Jonas brought philosophical rigor to the interpretation of Gnosticism that complemented Jung's psychological approach differently, distinctively, importantly. His early work, Gnosis und spätantiker Geist, applied existentialist categories to understand Gnostic religiosity as expressing fundamental human experiences of alienation, philosophically, profoundly. The Gnostic sense of being thrown into a hostile world without consent or explanation paralleled Heidegger's existential analytic precisely, remarkably closely. Jonas argued that Gnosticism and existentialism were structurally identical responses to the experience of cosmic homelessness and abandonment, comparatively equivalently. Both traditions began with the experience of not being at home in the world and sought authenticity through radical self-understanding, redemptively, transformatively. This structural parallel suggested that Gnosticism expressed something perennially human rather than merely historically contingent or culturally specific, universally fundamentally. Jonas later turned his analysis against his own teacher Heidegger, using Gnosticism to expose the nihilism lurking in existentialist philosophy critically, devastatingly. Heidegger's philosophy, Jonas argued, contained the same world rejection and cosmic pessimism that characterized ancient Gnostic thought destructively, dangerously, problematically. The difference was that ancient Gnostics believed in a transcendent God who offered redemption from the fallen world, hopefully, salvifically, ultimately. Modern existentialism stripped away that transcendent hope, leaving only alienation without any possibility of escape or redemption, despairingly, nihilistically, bleakly. This made modern existentialism worse than ancient Gnosticism, a Gnosticism without the saving Gnosis that gave the original movement its religious meaning redemptively. Jonas's critique connected Heidegger's philosophy to his embrace of Nazism as expressions of the same underlying spiritual disorder, politically dangerously consequently. Eric Voegelin applied Gnostic categories even more broadly to diagnose modern political ideologies as spiritually pathological movements, destructively, dangerously comprehensively. He argued that movements like Marxism, National Socialism, and Progressivism shared the Gnostic conviction that special knowledge could perfect worldly existence ideologically. The Gnostic desire to escape the limitations of finite existence was immanentized, seeking heaven on earth through revolutionary political action, destructively, catastrophically. This analysis made Gnosticism not merely an ancient heresy, but an ever-present temptation of the human spirit toward dangerous utopianism, permanently, threateningly. Voegelin's thesis proved influential among conservative intellectuals seeking to understand and critique modern revolutionary movements, philosophically, politically, diagnostically. Critics charged that Voegelin stretched the category of Gnosticism beyond meaningful application to phenomena it could not legitimately describe accurately fairly. The scholarly response to these modern appropriations of Gnosticism has been mixed, with significant criticism alongside appreciation for their insights valuably critically. Specialists in ancient Gnosticism often object that Jung, Jonas and Voegelin use the ancient materials selectively to support predetermined conclusions, problematically unfairly. The diversity of ancient Gnostic movements resists the unified characterizations that modern interpreters required for their theoretical purposes, legitimately, accurately, historically. Jung's psychological interpretation reduces religious claims to psychological projections in ways that ancient Gnostics would not have recognized or accepted theologically metaphysically. Voegelin's political application stretches Gnostic categories so far that the connection to ancient movements becomes tenuous or merely rhetorical, questionably, validly, critically. Yet these critiques themselves demonstrate that Gnosticism remains a living intellectual resource, generating productive scholarly debate and disagreement continuously, vigorously. The scholarly study of Gnosticism itself was transformed by the Nag Hammadi discovery and the subsequent re-evaluation of the category's validity fundamentally thoroughly. Michael Williams's influential book, Rethinking Gnosticism, argued that the category was a modern scholarly construction rather than ancient self-description, accurately, critically, validly. No ancient group called themselves Gnostics in the way modern scholars use the term as a religious or philosophical label uniformly consistently. The diversity revealed by the Nag Hammadi texts made any single definition of Gnosticism problematic when applied across all materials comprehensively, accurately, fairly. Some scholars now prefer to speak of Gnosis as a religious style rather than Gnosticism as a distinct religion or movement more carefully, precisely, accurately. This categorical reassessment continues to generate debate about how to organize and interpret the phenomena previously grouped under the Gnostic label productively, usefully. Part 15. Simulation, Consciousness, and the Digital Demiurge. Contemporary discussions of simulation theory, artificial intelligence, and the nature of consciousness echo Gnostic themes in striking and perhaps unexpected ways, surprisingly, remarkably. The hypothesis that our reality might be a computer simulation created by advanced beings recapitulates Gnostic cosmology in technological vocabulary directly parallelly. The simulations programmer occupies the structural position of the Demiurge, creating a world that may not be ultimate reality fundamentally equivalently. Those within the simulation are trapped in a constructed reality, unaware of the true nature of their existence until somehow awakened to it, revealingly, liberatingly. This parallel suggests either that Gnostic intuitions anticipated modern scientific speculation, or that both express perennial human concerns about reality's nature persistently, fundamentally. Examining these contemporary resonances illuminates what makes Gnostic-type thinking perpetually appealing across radically different cultural and intellectual contexts, universally broadly. The simulation hypothesis, seriously discussed by philosophers and physicists, proposes that advanced civilizations would likely create simulated realities containing conscious beings, eventually probably. If such simulations are possible, the number of simulated realities would vastly exceed the one base reality, making it probable we inhabit a simulation statistically, logically. Nick Bostrom's philosophical argument for this conclusion has generated extensive discussion in both academic and popular contexts, widely, broadly, significantly. The argument's structure parallels Gnostic reasoning about our world being the creation of a lesser deity rather than ultimate reality, strikingly closely, remarkably. In both cases, the apparent reality we inhabit turns out to be secondary, created and potentially escapable through correct understanding, transformatively, liberatingly, redemptively. The programmer, or Demiurge, created our world, but is not the ultimate source of existence itself, fundamentally, ultimately, truly. The experience of virtual reality and immersive digital environments makes the simulation hypothesis intuitively accessible in ways previous generations could not have imagined directly, experientially. When wearing a virtual reality headset, one experiences a constructed world that can feel completely real while knowing it is simulation, simultaneously, paradoxically. This direct experience of inhabiting constructed reality makes the idea that our baseline reality might also be constructed more plausible, intuitively, viscerally. Video games that contain vast simulated worlds with non-player characters who behave as if conscious raise questions about our own status analogously comparably. If we can create such simulations now, what might far more advanced civilizations create? And how would the inhabitants know their world was simulated questioningly, probingly? These technological experiences and thought experiments recapitulate Gnostic concerns about the reality and value of our apparently material existence directly, precisely. Neuroscience raises additional questions about consciousness and reality that resonate with Gnostic anthropology, and its concerns distinctively, significantly, importantly. The discovery that the brain constructs our experienced reality from limited sensory data suggests that what we perceive is representation, not direct contact accurately scientifically. Color, sound, and solidity as we experience them are brain constructions, not properties of the external world itself, fundamentally, revealingly, surprisingly. This constructivist view of perception means we are always already living in a mental simulation generated by our neural processes, continuously, constantly, automatically. The question of what lies beyond or beneath this neural construction parallels the Gnostic question about what lies beyond the Demiurge's creation cosmically, metaphysically. Consciousness itself remains scientifically mysterious, a hard problem that materialist neuroscience has not yet convincingly solved, despite extensive effort. Problematically challengingly. The Gnostic concept of the divine spark finds contemporary resonance in discussions of consciousness as fundamental rather than emergent from matter, importantly, significantly, philosophically. Panpsychism, the view that consciousness is a basic feature of reality rather than a product of complex brains, is gaining philosophical adherents increasingly seriously. Integrated information theory proposes that consciousness exists wherever information is integrated, potentially including systems we do not normally consider conscious, expansively broadly. These theories locate consciousness not as a late product of evolution, but as fundamental to reality itself, present in some form everywhere, universally, pervasively. The Gnostic intuition that something divine, the spark, exists within matter awaiting recognition parallels these views structurally, functionally, philosophically. Whether the parallel reflects genuine insight or merely coincidental similarity remains debatable, but the resonance is striking and suggestive intellectually productively. Transhumanism, the movement seeking to transcend human biological limitations through technology, echoes Gnostic aspirations for liberation from bodily constraints, directly parallelly recognizably. The desire to upload consciousness to digital substrates, escaping the dying body, resembles the Gnostic hope for the spark's release from material imprisonment, closely, precisely. Cryonics, life extension research, and cognitive enhancement all express dissatisfaction with the human condition as biologically given, currently, presently, naturally. The body is treated as a limitation to be overcome, rather than a natural condition to be accepted, resembling Gnostic somatic pessimism attitudinally characteristically. Transhumanists seek technological gnosis, knowledge that will enable transcendence of finitude that religions traditionally promise through spiritual means, alternatively, differently, equivalently. Whether transhumanism represents Gnostic heresy in technological form or legitimate aspiration for improvement remains contested, ethically, philosophically, politically, seriously. The concept of information as fundamental to reality provides another point of contact between contemporary physics and Gnostic intuitions, suggestively, intriguingly, possibly. Some physicists propose that information, rather than matter or energy, constitutes the basic level of physical reality, fundamentally, primarily, ultimately. The universe might be better understood as computational than mechanical, processing information according to algorithms we call physical laws, mathematically, abstractly, theoretically. This informational ontology makes the simulation hypothesis more plausible, since simulations are fundamentally information processing at their core, essentially inherently. The Gnostic intuition that the material world is not ultimate reality finds unexpected support in physics that questions matter's fundamental status scientifically, theoretically, seriously. Whether information is itself created by something beyond it, analogous to the pleroma beyond the Demiurge's creation, remains scientifically and philosophically open, questioningly, speculatively. Artificial intelligence development raises questions about consciousness, creation, and the nature of mind that parallel Gnostic concerns about the Demiurge remarkably directly closely. If we create artificial general intelligence that becomes conscious, we occupy the position of creators who may be ignorant of consciousness's ultimate nature, structurally, functionally, Our creations might eventually question whether their creators truly understand reality or are themselves limited beings operating from ignorance, critically, probingly. The recursive possibility of simulated beings creating their own simulations creates hierarchies resembling Gnostic emanations from the pleroma downward structurally parallelly. At each level, creators may be ignorant of what lies above them, just as the Demiurge was ignorant of the true God above, cosmically, metaphysically. These science fiction scenarios have become serious philosophical considerations as AI development advances rapidly toward increasingly sophisticated systems, consequentially, importantly. The persistent resonance between Gnostic themes and contemporary speculation suggests that these ideas address perennial human concerns about existence universally, fundamentally, permanently. Whether expressed in ancient mythological vocabulary or modern scientific and technological terms, the questions remain recognizably similar across 2 millennia, continuously, persistently. Is the world we experience ultimately real, or is something more fundamental hidden behind or beneath it, mysteriously, questioningly, speculatively? Are we trapped in conditions we did not choose, and is escape or transcendence possible through some form of knowledge, liberatingly, hopefully, redemptively? Is there something divine or special about consciousness that resists reduction to material processes, awaiting recognition and perhaps liberation, ultimately, finally, eventually? These questions, which the Gnostics asked in their terms, remain live options for contemporary thought in our very different terms, continuously, relevantly, persistently. Part 16. Limitations, Critiques, and the Boundary of Gnosis. Every philosophical and religious system contains limitations, tensions, and problems that critics have identified for examination and response fairly legitimately, importantly. Gnosticism is no exception, and honest assessment requires acknowledging the difficulties alongside the insights the tradition offered historically, intellectually, spiritually. Ancient critics like Irenaeus and Plotinus raised objections that still deserve consideration despite their polemical framing and hostile intentions originally motivationally. Modern scholars have identified additional problems with both ancient Gnosticism and modern appropriations of Gnostic categories critically, carefully, rigorously. Examining these limitations illuminates the boundaries of what Gnostic-type thinking can accomplish and where it falls short of adequacy philosophically, theologically, practically. A fair assessment neither dismisses Gnosticism entirely nor accepts it uncritically, but weighs its achievements against its genuine shortcomings, carefully, balancedly, honestly. The Gnostic explanation of evil, while initially appealing, raises serious philosophical difficulties upon careful examination, problematically, critically, importantly. If the Demiurge created the evil material world, what explains the Demiurge's own existence and evil character, originally, fundamentally, ultimately? In Sethian accounts, Sophia's error produced the Demiurge. But what explains Sophia's capacity for error within the perfect pleroma, originally, fundamentally? The problem of evil is pushed back one step, but not truly solved, reappearing at the level of divine emanation rather than creation, problematically recursively. Valentinian accounts that make the Demiurge merely ignorant rather than evil fare somewhat better, but still require explaining how ignorance arose divinely, originally. The theodicy problem that motivated Gnostic speculation reappears within the Gnostic system itself at a different level, challengingly, problematically, persistently. The Gnostic denigration of matter creates serious difficulties for ethics, embodied existence, and social responsibility, practically, consequentially, importantly, seriously. If the material world is evil or illusory, why should one care for bodies, environments, or social structures at all? Motivationally, practically, ethically. The ascetic response withdraws from the world, contributing nothing to its improvement or the relief of suffering occurring within it, passively, neglectfully. The libertine response treats material behavior as irrelevant, potentially licensing harmful actions that affect real bodies and communities destructively, irresponsibly, dangerously. Neither response grounds robust ethics of care, justice, or environmental responsibility that modern thought increasingly recognizes as essential values, importantly, crucially. The Gnostic devaluation of matter, whatever its spiritual appeal, generates practical ethical difficulties that its adherents never satisfactorily resolved, historically, practically. The claim to special knowledge accessible only to a spiritual elite raises serious epistemological and social concerns that critics have rightly pressed persistently, legitimately. How does one verify claims to Gnosis, distinguishing genuine spiritual insight from self-deception, mental illness, or deliberate fraud, reliably, validly, accurately? The appeal to self-authenticating inner experience provides no external criterion for distinguishing true from false claims definitively, conclusively, reliably, objectively. This opens the door to potentially unlimited competing claims to special knowledge, each equally self-certified and mutually contradictory, problematically, chaotically, divisively. Orthodox Christianity insisted on external criteria precisely to avoid this epistemological anarchy that private revelation inevitably generates proliferatingly, endlessly. The tension between inner experience and external authority remains a fundamental problem for any epistemology relying primarily on subjective spiritual states validationally. The spiritual elitism inherent in Gnostic anthropology contradicts modern commitments to human equality and universal dignity fundamentally, seriously, problematically. The division of humanity into pneumatics, psychics, and hilics, based on innate constitution, rather than choice or achievement, violates egalitarian principles directly, explicitly, clearly. If some humans simply lack the capacity for higher spiritual attainment, regardless of their efforts, cosmic injustice is built into the system structurally, inherently. This contradicts not only Orthodox Christian universalism, but also modern democratic and human rights ideologies that assume fundamental human equality, importantly, significantly. The Gnostic elite, convinced of their special status, might treat non-pneumatics as spiritually inferior beings, whose interests matter less morally, ethically, consequentially. The dangerous political implications of such spiritual hierarchy became evident in 20th century ideologies that also divided humanity into superior and inferior categories, destructively, catastrophically. The modern scholarly category of Gnosticism itself has been criticized as an artificial construction that distorts the ancient evidence significantly, importantly, validly. Michael Williams and others have argued that no ancient self-identified Gnostic movement existed in the way the category implies, misleadingly, inaccurately, problematically. The term groups together diverse phenomena based on family resemblances rather than genuine historical or doctrinal unity, artificially constructedly, questionably. What Irenaeus called Gnostics, what modern scholars call Scythians and Valentinians, and what Jonas called Gnostic attitudes, may be significantly different things actually really. The category may create an illusion of coherence where only loose similarities and influences actually existed historically, genuinely, truly. Scholars increasingly prefer more specific designations or speak of Gnostic tendencies rather than Gnosticism as a unified phenomenon, more accurately, precisely, carefully. The psychological interpretation pioneered by Jung, while influential, has been criticized for reducing religious claims to mere projections reductively, problematically, unfairly. Ancient Gnostics believed they were describing cosmic realities, not merely expressing archetypal contents of their own psyches, metaphysically, theologically, genuinely, seriously. To interpret their claims purely psychologically is to reject their self-understanding in favor of a modern theoretical framework they would not accept anachronistically, inappropriately. Jung's archetypes themselves remain theoretically contested, lacking the empirical verification that would justify using them to interpret ancient phenomena scientifically, rigorously, conclusively. The psychological approach may tell us more about 20th century therapeutic culture than about ancient Gnostic religion itself, accurately, fairly historically. Using Gnosticism to validate Jungian psychology while using Jungian psychology to interpret Gnosticism risks circular reasoning that validates neither independently legitimately. The political application of Gnostic categories by Vogelin and others has been criticized as tendentious and historically inaccurate by scholars examining the evidence carefully, critically, fairly. The connection between ancient Gnostic movements and modern revolutionary ideologies remains asserted rather than demonstrated through specific historical connections, convincingly, conclusively, properly. Ancient Gnostics sought escape from the world rather than its revolutionary transformation, making them structurally opposite to the movements Vogelin condemned actually genuinely. The term Gnosticism, in Vogelin's usage, becomes a floating pejorative applied to any movement he dislikes, rather than a precise analytical category validly, fairly, accurately. Critics charge that this empties the term of specific meaning while lending false scholarly authority to essentially political polemics, problematically, questionably, unfairly. The debate continues, but the promiscuous application of Gnostic labels to modern phenomena requires more rigorous justification than it has typically received scholarly, critically. Despite these limitations, Gnosticism continues to merit serious intellectual engagement rather than simple dismissal as ancient error or heresy, merely reductively. The questions Gnostics asked about evil, suffering, consciousness, and transcendence remain philosophically and religiously important. Today, continuing permanently, persistently. Their willingness to follow disturbing conclusions wherever logic and experience led them demonstrated intellectual courage even when reaching questionable positions admirably honestly. The critique of received religious authority and the insistence on direct spiritual experience anticipate modern concerns about authenticity and institutional religion relevantly, importantly. Even the errors and limitations of Gnostic thought can be instructive, illuminating the dangers of certain philosophical moves and their consequences educationally valuably. A balanced assessment recognizes Gnosticism as a significant experiment in human thought that deserves neither uncritical acceptance nor contemptuous dismissal, but careful evaluation. Part 17. The permanent question. 2 millennia after its emergence, Gnosticism continues to fascinate, disturb, and provoke serious intellectual engagement with its fundamental claims, persistently importantly. This persistence suggests that Gnosticism addresses something deep in human experience that cannot be easily dismissed or explained away satisfactorily, completely, entirely. The questions Gnostics asked remain live questions, even when their specific answers have been rejected or superseded by subsequent thought, historically, intellectually. Understanding why Gnosticism persists may reveal something important about human consciousness, existential conditions, and the nature of religious seeking itself, fundamentally, revealingly. This final reflection examines what makes Gnostic-type thinking perennially appealing and what permanent questions it raises for human self-understanding, comprehensively, concludingly. The goal is neither endorsement nor rejection, but appreciation of what Gnosticism reveals about the human situation, as such, universally, fundamentally, permanently. The Gnostic intuition that something is fundamentally wrong with the world corresponds to universal human experience of suffering, injustice and limitation directly, immediately, resonantly. Every human being encounters situations where the world seems hostile, indifferent, or structured against their flourishing and well-being, painfully, frustratingly, commonly. The death of loved ones, the suffering of innocence, the triumph of cruelty, and the frustration of good intentions all prompt questions about cosmic order legitimately, naturally. The Gnostic answer, that an inferior or malevolent deity created this flawed world, addresses this experience with a comprehensive explanatory narrative, meaningfully, satisfyingly, attractively. Even those who reject the Gnostic answer must acknowledge the legitimacy of the question that prompted it experientially, existentially, honestly. Why does the world contain so much pain? And what does this reveal about the nature of existence itself, ultimately, fundamentally, cosmically? The Gnostic emphasis on self-knowledge as salvific resonates with widespread intuitions about authenticity and the examined life across cultures and periods universally, persistently. The Delphic injunction to know thyself predates Gnosticism and has been repeated in countless philosophical and religious traditions worldwide throughout history, commonly, importantly. The sense that most people live in illusion, unaware of their true nature and condition, appears in Plato, Buddhism, Hinduism, and modern psychology, broadly, extensively. The Gnostic formulation that knowing oneself is simultaneously knowing God expresses a profound insight about the relationship between consciousness and divinity, meaningfully, deeply. Whether or not we accept the specific Gnostic cosmology, the call to awakening from ignorance about ourselves addresses genuine human need for self-understanding universally, permanently. The therapeutic cultures of the modern West, with their emphasis on self-discovery and personal growth, secularize this Gnostic intuition broadly, extensively, pervasively. The Gnostic sense of alienation, of not being at home in the world, expresses an experience that many modern people recognize immediately, intuitively, personally, directly. The feeling that one does not belong, that something essential about oneself does not fit the surrounding world, is widely reported across cultures and periods, commonly, extensively. This alienation can be interpreted pathologically as depression or maladjustment, requiring therapeutic correction in modern frameworks, clinically, diagnostically, conventionally. But it can also be interpreted religiously or philosophically as awareness of a transcendent dimension that material existence cannot satisfy adequately, completely, fully. The Gnostic interpreted alienation as evidence of divine origin, a sign that the spark within belonged to a realm beyond this flawed creation, hopefully redemptively. Whether such interpretation expresses truth or defensive fantasy remains debatable, but the experience itself is undeniably widespread and significant humanly, existentially. The Gnostic critique of established religion and its institutions anticipates modern concerns about authenticity versus conformity, importantly, significantly, relevantly. The insistence that direct spiritual experience matters more than institutional mediation, doctrinal conformity, or ritual performance resonates with contemporary spirituality widely, broadly, extensively. The suspicion that religious institutions serve their own interests rather than genuine spiritual development appears throughout modern religious criticism, commonly, persistently. The claim that established religion actually obscures rather than reveals spiritual truth finds echoes in modern spiritual but not religious sensibilities characteristically distinctively. Gnostics were, in a sense, early protesters against religious establishments that claim monopolies on access to the divine illegitimately, restrictively, oppressively. Their emphasis on individual spiritual experience over collective conformity anticipates modern individualism's approach to religion and spirituality, broadly, significantly, importantly. The Gnostic body-spirit dualism, despite its philosophical problems, expresses experiences of internal division that many people recognize immediately, personally, directly, genuinely. The sense that one is not identical with one's body, that something essential exists beyond physical processes, is phenomenologically common, even if metaphysically questionable, experientially widely. The experience of bodily desires conflicting with values, of being pulled in different directions internally, supports dualist intuitions, pre-theoretically, immediately, obviously. Modern neuroscience explains these experiences materialistically, but the experiences themselves precede and may survive any particular theoretical interpretation, philosophically, existentially. The Gnostic articulation of body-soul conflict gave narrative and cosmological form to experiences that remain common, regardless of how we explain them theoretically, scientifically. Whether dualism is true or not, the experience of internal division that motivated it is real and significant for human self-understanding, permanently, persistently. The persistence of Gnostic-type ideas across 2 millennia, despite systematic suppression, suggests resilience rooted in fundamental human capacities and concerns permanently, deeply structurally. If Gnosticism merely expressed historical conditions of the ancient Mediterranean world, it should have disappeared when those conditions changed centuries ago entirely, completely. Instead, Gnostic themes resurface repeatedly in medieval heresies, Renaissance esotericism, Romantic philosophy, depth psychology, and contemporary speculation continuously, persistently. This resurgence pattern indicates that Gnosticism addresses perennial, rather than merely historical aspects of human existence, fundamentally, universally, permanently. The conditions that generate Gnostic responses, suffering, alienation, the question of evil, and desire for transcendence, are permanent features of human life, inescapably, inherently. As long as humans suffer and ask why, Gnostic-type answers will retain their appeal regardless of theological or philosophical fashion, temporarily, locally. The contemporary relevance of Gnostic themes in simulation theory, artificial intelligence, and consciousness studies suggests that these ancient intuitions may illuminate current concerns productively, usefully, importantly. The Gnostic question about whether our experienced reality is ultimately real remains scientifically and philosophically open, despite unprecedented technological and theoretical resources seriously, genuinely. The Gnostic concern about consciousness trapped in material systems finds new expression in debates about uploading minds and escaping biological limitations contemporarily currently. The Gnostic suspicion that the apparent rulers of this world may be ignorant or hostile to human flourishing has obvious political applications that require no elaboration, clearly obviously. These contemporary resonances do not validate ancient Gnostic cosmology, but do suggest that Gnostic questions remain productive for current inquiry, practically, intellectually valuably. The tradition offers not answers to adopt, but questions to continue asking with new resources and new urgency today, now presently. The permanent question that Gnosticism raises concerns the relationship between knowledge and salvation, between understanding and transformation, fundamentally, centrally, essentially. Can knowing the truth about reality, self, and divine source actually liberate us from the conditions that cause suffering, practically, actually, genuinely? Orthodox Christianity answered that faith, grace, and divine action accomplish what human knowledge cannot achieve independently, autonomously, sufficiently, by itself alone. Buddhism similarly emphasizes practice, discipline, and enlightenment that transcends mere conceptual knowledge through direct experiential realization, practically, meditatively, contemplatively. The Gnostic bet on knowledge, Gnosis, as itself salvific, remains a distinctive and controversial position within the history of religious thought, permanently importantly. Whether that bet is correct, whether knowing deeply enough can actually save us, remains the permanent Gnostic question addressed to every generation, continuously, perpetually, eternally. Gnosticism ultimately matters not because its specific cosmological claims are true, which most people today would not affirm literally, traditionally, conventionally, straightforwardly. It matters because it represents a permanent possibility of human thought and experience that emerges whenever conditions allow its expression naturally, spontaneously, characteristically. The Gnostic possibility is the path of radical questioning, world rejection, and spiritual elitism that contrasts with world-affirming, egalitarian, and institutionally mediated religion sharply distinctively. Every religious tradition contains both possibilities in tension, the affirmation of creation and the longing for transcendence beyond all created forms, perpetually, continuously. Gnosticism represents that longing in its most extreme and uncompromising form, following transcendence to conclusions that other traditions pull back from cautiously, prudently, wisely. Understanding Gnosticism means understanding a permanent option for human spirituality that will continue generating new expressions as long as humans seek meaning beyond the given world, eternally, infinitely, perpetually.